Hi, everybody. Tonight, we begin a quiet journey, one that floats gently on the waves of history, whispered by the wind and long buried beneath the salt and spray of forgotten seas. Our story weaves through time, not in the roaring clamor of cannon fire or the thunder of warships, but in the almost silent aftermath. We follow the traces of those who once defied the rigid laws of sea and society. Female pirates. We ask what happened to them after capture. After the battles were lost and the sails furled for good. This is not a story of glory, nor one of conquest. It is a story of consequences, of loss, and of what remains. Some faced the gallows, others a quiet vanishing into chains. A few were never heard from again. Across 24 slow chapters, we'll tell their tales, not the ones etched in blood, but those written in the dim candlelight of prisons, courtrooms, and fading memory. Let's begin gently. Bonny sat alone in a dark, damp cell in Jamaica. It was the year 1720. The air was thick, a humid shadow pressing down on her chest, sticky and unrelenting. Her red hair, once wild and untamed like a burning flag in the wind, hung limp around her face, strands clinging to her cheeks like weeping ivy. Her clothes, those rugged, defiant garments once soaked with salt water and rum, had turned stiff and grimy. She no longer smelled like the sea, nor of freedom. She smelled like earth and rot. For days, weeks maybe, she had not spoken. There was no one to speak to, save the occasional shuffle of boots echoing down the stone corridor, followed by the clank of a tray slid into her cell. The food was gray and flavorless. Sometimes a rat would reach the bread before she did. Sometimes she let it. But Anne was not dead. Not yet. The gallows waited. She knew they waited. But they had not come for her. Not while her belly was swollen with life. Pregnancy. It was a twist of fate she hadn't expected. Perhaps she had hoped, distantly, for some form of divine mercy. And it came, not for her, but for the child growing inside her, the child of Calico Jack Rackham, who now lay buried in unconsecrated ground, his body swinging one last time before the crows tore it from the gibbet. That image haunted her, as much as any fear of what might become of her own bones. Bonny, like her comrade Mary Reed, had stood trial in Spanish Town. Both were convicted, both were sentenced to hang, and both had made the same desperate plea. We plead our bellies, they had said, and in that phrase, quaint, archaic, laced with trembling hope, was their only salvation. The court could not, by law or decency, execute a woman carrying life, and so they waited. Days became weeks. Prison turned from holding place to limbo. Mary, poor Mary, had grown weaker. Her eyes dulled. Her laughter, once a sharp burst of mischief in the dark, had vanished. Fever took her, or despair, or both. She died in that prison before her child could see the world. But Anne endured. Word of her fate spread, whispers in taverns, gossip in the drawing rooms of Kingston. Had she escaped? Was she rescued? Was she set free and spirited away? Some claimed she died in childbirth and was buried without ceremony. Others insisted her father, a plantation owner with shameful secrets of his own, paid her way to a quiet life, far from the seas. No records confirmed her death. No grave bears her name. She simply vanished. And so her story is the one we return to, not because she was the most vicious, nor the most famous, but because her ending was never written. She remains unfinished, suspended in the same space her cell once occupied, cold, uncertain, and waiting. But Anne was not the only one. Across the Atlantic, centuries before and centuries later, women found themselves captured, not just by shackles, but by society's disbelief that they ever dared to become pirates in the first place. There was Jeanne de Clisson, the lioness of Brittany. Her story ended not with chains, but with a strange retreat into noble life. She had begun her vengeance on the sea after the execution of her husband by the French crown. Her transformation from grieving widow to ruthless privateer was swift, and the black fleet she commanded left no French vessel untouched. Yet, when the rage burned out, she married again, moved inland, died quietly, perhaps peacefully. Was that truly the end? Or did she spend her final years haunted by blood-soaked memories, unable to reconcile the hands she used to caress her children with the hands that slit the throats of French commanders? It's easy to imagine her sitting by a window in her later years, watching storms roll in across the fields, heart beating a little faster when the wind whistled like sails snapping in combat. But most women weren't so lucky. They were captured, tried, forgotten. Sometimes no trial came at all. Execution without formalities was common, especially if the woman had dressed as a man. That deception, crossing gender as well as legal lines, was viewed by many as a deeper offense than piracy itself. In the British Navy logs, cases were recorded with a tone of mild disbelief. Found among the crew a woman. No name, no age, no dignity. Imagine that. Your entire story reduced to a footnote. Found among the crew. One such woman was Fanny Campbell, or so the legends say. Her story might be more fiction than fact, printed in 1845 and sold as a popular novel, but truth often hides behind myth. She disguised herself as a man to rescue her lover from slavery in the Caribbean. Along the way, she took up piracy, commanded ships, and became for a time feared, revered. After the mission was complete, she supposedly returned to Boston, married, and became a wife and mother. But one has to ask, could someone who tasted such freedom, such fire, simply go back to pouring tea and hemming clothes? Could she sleep in peace, her sabers buried in the attic? Maybe, maybe not. That's the strange paradox of captured female pirates. For some, capture was the end of life, of adventure. For others, it was merely a transformation, from rebel to recluse, from outlaw to urban legend. But for all of them, the moment the chains closed around their wrists, the world stopped seeing them as people and began seeing them as problems to be solved. Too dangerous to live, too rare to understand. Tonight and over many nights, we'll gently uncover their endings, one by one, slowly, thoughtfully, with silence between the sentences where your mind can wander. You may feel sadness, you may feel anger, but most of all, you may feel the presence of ghosts, watching, waiting, wondering if they will ever be remembered beyond that last bitter breath. Let us remember them, one quiet hour at a time. Shall we continue? The cold breath of dawn crept through the barred window of the small Jamaican prison, tracing the curve of Anne Bonny's cheek with pale light. She lay still, eyes open, staring at the crumbling ceiling. A single crack had formed a familiar path. She had counted its jagged arms 100 times. In another life, she might have traced stars. Now she traced decay. She was not alone in that cell. Though Mary Reed's body had long since been taken away, wrapped in linen, unceremoniously buried, her memory lingered. Not just as a ghost, but in the weight Anne felt pressing down on her, an ache that radiated from her chest out to her fingertips. It was as if Mary had never truly left. Her laughter, brief and cynical. Her stories of life aboard ships where men learned too late that the man beside them wore not a beard, but a smirk beneath her hat. Mary had not feared the gallows. Not really. She had feared being forgotten. Anne, though, she feared both. When guards passed her cell, they seldom looked in. She no longer held their interest. The novelty of a woman pirate had faded. She was simply one more prisoner waiting out time, a womb delaying judgment. And what happened after the child came? Would they keep their word? Would the hangman wait just long enough to cut 2 lives from the world instead of 1? She pressed a hand to her belly, still small, still hidden. It wasn't just the guards who grew silent. The whispers in town had quieted too. The spectacle was over. Calico Jack had been hanged already. His name was now just another tale in the taverns, embellished with each retelling. He died smiling, some said. He wept, said others. But Anne remembered. He looked at her, only her, until the hood was drawn and the lever pulled. He had offered her a kind of freedom once. Wild, brash, impossible. A world where she was not a woman confined to corsets and expectations, but a force among storms and steel. And though she had loved that freedom, she had never truly loved the man. Perhaps that was the cruelest part of all. The clink of keys at the far end of the hall stirred her. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. They came not with the hurried rhythm of the guards on shift, but with something else, hesitation perhaps. She sat up, her joints ached, her back screamed, but she stood. The figure who appeared at the bars was cloaked, hooded, features obscured by shadows. A voice, low and barely more than a whisper, slipped through the air like smoke. Anne? She blinked. The voice had a chill to it, elegant, clipped, the voice of someone who belonged behind mahogany desks and velvet curtains. Who are you? She asked, hoarse. The figure reached into their cloak and withdrew a folded letter, pressing it through the bars. She hesitated. Paper was rare here, precious. She took it with trembling fingers. Read it after I'm gone, the voice said. You'll know what to do. Before she could speak again, the figure was gone, swallowed by darkness. She clutched the letter but did not unfold it. Instead, she sat again, hands in her lap. The paper felt warm, as if it still carried heat from another world. Far away, on the edges of the Barbary coast, a different kind of wind howled through a different kind of prison. Zainab al-Ashraf had once ruled the Red Sea with cunning and steel. Though her name was not carried on the tongues of English sailors, in the harbors of Mocha and Aden, she was known as the Crescent Queen. Her small fleet harried merchant ships with surgical precision, then disappeared into coastal mists. Her face was veiled, her voice rarely raised, but her commands were sharp, her judgments final. She was captured not in battle, but in betrayal. A man she had once spared, a rival traitor, returned with gifts and apologies. She met him in good faith, believing in the code of hospitality sacred to her land. He drugged her wine. By the time her guards realized what had happened, she was already bound in iron and loaded onto a Portuguese ship. Her imprisonment was different from Anne's. The Portuguese had no trial in mind. No courtroom, no waiting gallows. They had other plans. She was to be displayed in Lisbon, paraded as a prize of imperial conquest like a lion in a cage. A woman who dared command ships, give orders to men, dictate the fate of gold and gunpowder. Her silence was more dangerous than a scream, and so they kept her mouth shut with cloth and pain. But Zainab did not break. Not entirely. As she was led off the ship in Lisbon, a crowd gathered, not large, not enthusiastic. Most did not know who she was. Some laughed, others whispered. And then a curious thing happened. A woman from the crowd, young, dressed in poor garments, stepped forward, looked Zainab in the eye, and said nothing. Just reached out and placed a tiny white flower at her feet before being pulled back by guards. Zainab remembered that flower more than any insult or injury. A jasmine bloom, a symbol of resistance and silence. She would not be executed. That was not the Portuguese way. They preferred spectacle. She would be placed in a monastery, a silent order, her veils replaced by habits, her speech taken by vow, a living death. The silence was meant to contain her. But in that silence, she began to write, not in letters, not in books, but in the subtle rituals of the day. The way she moved, the way she folded linens, the way she touched earth in the garden. Other women noticed, began to mimic her, learn from her without words. Within months, the silence became a choir of memory. She had not escaped her chains. She had merely turned them into symbols. Back in Jamaica, Anne finally opened the letter. It was short, 5 lines, no signature. You have friends still, not many, but enough. The ship comes at the moon's dark turning. You know the code. If you can walk, you can be free, but you must choose. She folded it, pressed it to her lips. Escape, or childbirth and rope. The night stretched out ahead like an open sea, and somewhere beyond it, a sail waited. The sail seemed smaller that night. Every shadow stretched longer. Every whisper of wind outside the thick stone walls carried a weight that pressed against Anne Bonny's chest. She had the letter tucked beneath the ragged fabric of her thin mattress, the words etched into her mind as clearly as if they'd been carved into the prison wall. The moon's dark turning. That meant 3 nights from now. Her mind wandered not forward, but backward, as it so often did when sleep refused her. She thought of the first ship she'd ever stepped onto as something more than a passenger. The way the deck had felt beneath her feet, alive, tilting and breathing. That sense of stepping into a world governed by tides and tempests, not rules and religion. That first night beneath open stars, away from the shores of expectation and the cold corridors of her father's estate. She'd left behind lace and linen and stepped into leather and lead. Anne had once thought herself invincible. The sea did that to you. But here, in this stone coffin of a room, it was easy to forget. She glanced down at her hands, once strong, calloused from ropes and blades, now thinner, paler, one knuckle bruised from slamming it against the wall days ago in a fit of rage, or maybe hopelessness. It was hard to separate the two anymore. But the letter had changed something. Hope was a dangerous thing, especially in places like this. It made your heart beat faster. It made silence feel like suspense instead of despair. It made every footstep outside the door sound like a promise or a threat. Escape. Could it be real, or was it a trap? Perhaps the governor or some naval officer wanted to see if she'd bite. Wanted to see if the lion still had claws. And if she did, well, a botched escape was easier than a public hanging. Still, what was the alternative? Give birth behind these walls. Wait for the midwife. Hear her child's first cry as guards prepared a noose. No, that would not be her ending. Miles away, across oceans and years, another woman paced a different kind of prison. In the southern ports of China, the great pirate queen Zheng Yi Sao, sometimes called Qing Shi in the West, had faced her own reckoning. She had once commanded a confederation of over 300 junks, tens of thousands of pirates. Her black flag fleet had brought the Chinese Imperial Navy to its knees, defied the Portuguese, and even outmaneuvered the British. But empires do not forget. Eventually, the emperor offered her amnesty, a rare thing, unheard of for a woman, let alone one with blood and gold on her hands. But she had become too powerful, too unpredictable. A battle would cost the state dearly. She accepted, but not because she feared them, because she understood something deeper. The sea changes, and so must the sailor. She had conditions, of course. She kept her wealth, her family, even her dignity. Most of her crew walked free. Some even offered positions in the Chinese Navy. The rest melted into the salt and fog. Zheng Yisao opened a gambling house. Respectable, if only in name. She dressed in silks. She spoke softly. But behind her eyes was the same sharpness, the same storm. She lived to an old age, a pirate who retired on her own terms. But those years were not easy. Power is difficult to put down, especially when it has defined your every breath. Each coin she counted, each hand of cards she dealt in her quiet parlor, was a distant echo of cannon fire. The sea never truly let her go, and she never truly left it. Anne sat on the edge of her cot now, her feet flat on the cold stone floor. The air around her buzzed with that heavy silence, thicker than it had been for days. She knew what she had to do, but she had to be sure she still had allies. In the cell across the corridor, a woman named Lorna had been watching her, not with curiosity, but with something quieter, recognition. Lorna had once been a dockhand in Kingston, thrown into prison for striking a naval officer after he cornered her in an alley. She'd never said more than a dozen words to Anne. But that night, as the moon cast no light, Lorna spoke. "You got someone coming?" Anne looked up. Their eyes met through the narrow gap in the stone. "Maybe," she replied. Lorna leaned her head back against the wall, let out a slow breath. "Then you'd better be ready. I can't do it alone." Lorna didn't answer immediately. Then, quietly, "I didn't think you could." And that was all. The next morning, Anne woke to find a sliver of rusted metal tucked under her tray, just long enough to work the lock on the iron cuff that held her to the wall at night. Lorna never said another word about it. In the port city of Cadiz, another woman sat in another cell, her fate sealed not by the gallows, but by the pages of the Inquisition. Isabella of Valencia had been captured in the Mediterranean, a woman of Moorish descent who had taken to piracy not for glory, but survival. Her ship had rescued slaves, burned slave-trading vessels, and plundered Christian ships with eerie precision. When she was caught, she was branded a heretic first, a pirate second. In the dungeons of the Inquisition, she was asked not just to confess her crimes, but to repent her identity. She refused. They offered her clemency in exchange for names. She gave them false ones. She was tortured, starved, mocked, and yet even in agony, she found ways to resist. She sang old songs in the dead of night, songs in a language none of her captors understood, but which spread through the stones like wind through leaves. No one knows what became of Isabella. Her name disappears from the records after a year, but in Cadiz on some spring nights, fishermen still say they hear a voice, soft and stubborn, floating on the tide, a woman singing. Back in Jamaica, Anne Bonny's cell felt tighter now, not from fear, but from readiness. She had the metal sliver. She had the knowledge. She had Lorna's silent nod. And in 2 nights, the moon would disappear, darkness would fall, and perhaps, just perhaps, she would rise. The rain began just after sunset. It wasn't a storm, not the kind Anne Bonny remembered, with lashing waves and sails snapping in the wind like gunshots. No, this was a quieter kind of rain, a drizzle that slipped down the stones like whispered warnings, gentle, relentless. It soaked into the walls, into the floor, into the very marrow of her bones. She sat still, legs pulled close to her chest, the rusted sliver of metal hidden in the cuff of her sleeve. She hadn't used it yet, hadn't dared, but she touched it often with her fingertips, feeling the edges, memorizing its weight. Knowing it was real was enough for now. The guards were quieter tonight. Two had passed by her cell since dusk, their footsteps slower than usual, their talk hushed. She had heard one of them mention a change in the moon, that it would be black tomorrow. A sailor's superstition, most likely. But Anne smiled. They had no idea what the darkness meant for her. She tried to eat, but her stomach churned. The bread was dry, the stew watery and sour. Her hands trembled as she lifted the wooden spoon, then set it down again. Her body had grown weaker, the muscles slack, the aches more constant. The baby inside her stirred only faintly now, a flutter here, a pressure there. It was not time yet, but it would be soon. Soon, a word that held both promise and dread. Elsewhere, in a land colder and harsher, another woman once awaited a different kind of escape. In the frigid cells beneath the Tower of London, back in the early 1600s, a Scottish-born pirate named Grain O'Malley had been held under suspicion, her allegiance to the English crown always in question. Though her prime had passed and her battles lay in the dust of memory, she had once commanded ships off the coasts of Ireland, her fiery mane as unmistakable as the white crest of waves breaking against English vessels. They called her the Pirate Queen of Connaught. Captured late in life not for piracy alone, but for rebellion, Gran refused to kneel. She negotiated directly with Queen Elizabeth Dwarf, a rare meeting between two fierce women, both hardened by power and isolation. Gran spoke not in trembling tones, but as an equal, and somehow she won her freedom. But her cell left its mark. Her joints stiffened in the damp. Her breath grew shallow. Even free, she would never again roam the sea. She lived her final years near Clew Bay, not far from where she was born. Locals say she would sit by the shore in the evenings, eyes cast toward the horizon, hands wrapped in worn wool, lips moving with silent chants to a sea that no longer answered. She died with the tide out. Some say she waited for it. Anne ran her thumb over the edge of the metal sliver once more, then, finally, moved to act. It was late enough that the guards wouldn't return for hours, and early enough that the hush of midnight still held the prison in a kind of spell. She brought her wrist to her lap, worked the sliver into the cuff lock. The mechanism was old, crusted with rust, but she had learned from years of watching men fiddle with locks, tricks of pressure and angle, how to listen with more than ears. It clicked. The manacle fell open. Her wrist throbbed with sudden freedom. She closed her eyes, just for a moment. Lorna's voice floated softly through the dark. You'll need the key to the outer door. It's hung by the far corner, near the chapel wall. There's only 2 that lead out. You have maybe 20 minutes between patrols. Anne didn't answer. She didn't need to. They understood each other now. 2 women bound by silence and steel, bound by the need to escape not just these walls, but what waited beyond them. She would move tomorrow night. Not tonight. Tonight was for breathing. Further south, long before Anne's capture, in the Caribbean town of Cartagena, there lived a woman named Maria Cobham. She was a servant first, then a stowaway, then a pirate by necessity. Her story was never written in the annals of naval history, but in the stories passed down among Afro-Caribbean communities, she was known as the ghost of the isthmus. She raided slavers, burned their holds, freed those chained below deck, and took them into her crew. Her ship bore no flag, only an old carved figurehead shaped like a weeping woman. When she was finally captured by a Spanish frigate, they found only silence aboard. The crew had vanished. Maria sat at the helm, alone, surrounded by scattered coins and broken chains. She said nothing during her trial. Not a word. The judges called her mad. The guards called her cursed. She was sentenced to death, but on the morning of her execution, the noose snapped twice. The rope simply would not hold. The governor, uneasy, commuted her sentence to life imprisonment. She died quietly in her cell years later. And still, her name is whispered in coastal villages whenever a slaver's wreck washes ashore without explanation. Anne lay back now, the manacle open, the metal sliver pressed back beneath her mattress. She had only one night left, one more night, and then the world would shift. She thought of Mary again, of her laughter, of her fury, of the way she'd gripped Anne's hand in the courtroom as the sentence was read. They had not cried. They had not begged. They had held on to each other with fingers tight as ropes. Mary was gone now, but Anne would carry her into the night, and maybe, just maybe, into the sea once more. The last day came wrapped in a strange quiet. No alarms, no shouts, no suspicious glances. Just the usual creak of footsteps above, the sound of buckets scraping against stone, and the low hum of prisoners coughing, muttering, breathing in the dampness that never left the air. The sun filtered through her tiny window in ribbons, faint and colorless, as if unsure whether it was worth reaching her at all. And Bonny sat with her back against the wall, her wrists hidden in the folds of her dress. The open manacle dangled near her ankle like a forgotten question. She listened, not just with her ears, but with every part of her. Listened for patterns, for routines, for the absence of sound. She had memorized the guards' steps, their routes, their voices. The way the older one whistled between his teeth when he grew bored. The younger one who lingered too long near the women's cells. They were ordinary men, no better and no worse than others she had outsmarted in her past. But this time the stakes were different. This time she didn't have a crew, no sails overhead, no wind behind her, only Lorna and her own 2 feet, and the child, of course. A secret heartbeat tucked beneath her own, a future unfinished and uncertain. She felt it move then, just a shift, a ripple, as if it too had heard the rain begin again outside. Gentle, soft, the kind of rain that whispered, not roared. She whispered back, so low only her child could hear. Not yet, not here. On the far coast of Morocco, in the shadow of a crumbling fortress, there once lived a woman named Halima. She had no surname, no records in naval logs, no bounties issued in her name. But her legend was carried on the tongues of fishermen and pearl divers, those who saw her red-sailed dhow vanish into the horizon like a scar in the sea. Halima was born to a Berber trader and a Spanish runaway. Her life was spent in motion, port to port, smuggling silks and stories. But when her husband was killed by Ottoman pirates, she did not grieve in silence. She took to the sea with a dagger and a borrowed crew. At first, it was revenge. Then it became something else. She never took prizes of wealth, only weapons, ammunition. Slaves, if she found them, she freed. If not, she buried the ships that carried them. She never killed more than she had to. But she never left a witness. They caught her once, in a small inlet north of Tangier, dragged her to land, bound her hands, brought her to a stone court beneath banners she didn't recognize. They asked her name. She spat on the floor. They asked her if she believed in mercy. She said only one word, no. That night, a storm tore through the coast, and by morning her cell was empty. No doors broken, no keys missing, just gone. And so her story returned to the sea, untethered. Back in Jamaica, the sun had begun to sink. Anne shifted restlessly. Her legs cramped, her shoulders ached from tension, but her mind was sharp, her senses honed like an old blade freshly whetted. She knew what she would need to do. First, the manacle, already undone. Second, timing the patrol. She waited until she heard the first pass. 2 guards, heavy boots, one humming tunelessly. She counted their steps. Third, the key. That would be the hardest part. Outside her cell, beyond the corridor, was a small chapel used by the guards, sometimes for prayer, more often for whiskey. On a hook just inside its entrance hung a ring of keys, only one of which opened the main corridor gate. She had been there once, months ago, dragged through in chains for questioning. She had memorized the layout, the hook, the position of the door. All she needed was to get there, and for that, she would need Lorna. Night fell. The moon was gone. The world was cast in silver-edged black, as though the heavens had drawn a curtain. Anne rose. Silently, she crept to the door of her cell. Lorna was already there on the other side, a thin silhouette against the flickering torchlight. No sound, Lorna mouthed. Anne nodded. Lorna had stolen a sliver of bone, sharp enough to lift a latch but not break a lock. She used it now, with deft fingers. The click was barely louder than a breath. The door eased open. Anne stepped out. The corridor smelled of mildew and old iron. The torchlight sputtered, casting shadows that danced with mockery. Every creak of the stone beneath their feet felt deafening. But they moved. Down the corridor, past the cells, past the sleeping, past the damned. At the corner before the chapel, Lorna paused, listened. No sound. Anne peered in. The keys hung as she remembered. She slipped inside, reached for them. Her fingers brushed metal, cold, reassuring. Then a voice. Who's there? A guard. Close. Anne froze. Lorna whispered from the corridor. Now. Anne took the ring. No time to search for the right one. Just took it all. Slipped back into the hall. Footsteps. Coming closer. They ran, not loudly, not wildly, but with urgency, feet whispering against stone, hearts thudding like drums beneath ribs. Down the hall to the gate. Lorna grabbed the keys, tried one, another, still no. Anne felt her throat close, then, click, the gate opened. They slipped through and vanished into the dark. Behind them, shouts, but no alarms. Not yet. Confusion held the guards longer than fear. Ahead of them, the outer wall, and beyond it, the cove. The jungle at night was alive with insects and breath. Every leaf held moisture. Every branch shifted with ghosts. Anne and Lorna moved through it like hunted animals, crouched low, clothes soaked, lungs burning. The cove was real. It was still there. And so was the ship. A small sloop, unmarked, unassuming, but ready. A figure stood near the edge of the surf, holding a lantern low. They recognized her face. Not a friend, but not an enemy either. An old fence. A woman who once bought stolen sugar and silks from Anne in Havana. She nodded once. "You're late," she said. Anne didn't answer. She stepped into the boat. Behind her, Lorna pushed off from the shore. The wind caught their sails, and the island began to shrink. Not fast, not with certainty, but with freedom. Again. For now. The sea was different than she remembered. Not in the way it moved. It still swelled and dipped like some breathing beast. But in how it sounded. Softer, somehow. Not as thunderous. Not as wild. Anne Bonny stood near the bow of the small sloop, her hands gripping the damp wood of the rail, her eyes locked on the horizon. There was no moon to light their path, only the low throb of stars, some hidden by cloud, some twinkling like distant candles. It wasn't a grand ship. It wasn't the Revenge or the William or any of the other stolen vessels Anne had once sailed, cannon-lined and brimming with stolen rum. No, this was a smuggler's boat, barely armed, fast enough for flight, but not for fight. But it floated. It obeyed the wind, and it was hers, at least for now. Lorna sat at the stern, hands on the tiller, her face unreadable, a woman who had already lived too many lives to show surprise anymore. They hadn't spoken much since the escape. There were no congratulations, no celebrations, just breath and movement and the slow undoing of tension in their spines. The woman who had waited at the cove, they only knew her as Magda, had said little too. She had brought the ship, as promised, not out of loyalty, Anne suspected, but out of debt or pragmatism. Smugglers made strange allies, but she hadn't asked for coin, not yet. Magda had disappeared below deck the moment they set sail, leaving Anne and Lorna alone with the creaking timbers and the rolling dark. Anne closed her eyes. She felt the salt air on her face, felt it enter her chest. And for a moment, she didn't think of the prison or the gallows or even the child inside her. She just felt the sea. On another ocean, in another age, a woman known as Saida al-Hura once stood just like this, at the helm of her ship, watching the waves like they were old friends. Born in the mountains of Granada, forced into exile as a child, Saida rose not through violence alone, but through strategy. She married into power, ruled a coastal city in northern Morocco, and commanded a fleet of corsairs who sailed with the blessing of the Ottoman Sultan. Her enemies called her pirate, her people called her queen, but even queens fall. Betrayed by her own son-in-law, Saida was ousted in her later years. No battle, no siege, just politics, cold and quiet. No one knows what became of her after that. Some say she returned to the mountains. Others say she boarded one final ship and vanished into the Strait of Gibraltar, never to be seen again. Like so many women of the sea, her end was not written, only guessed. But on quiet nights, sailors near the Moroccan coast claimed to see a white-sailed ship in the distance, moving faster than wind should carry it, vanishing before morning. Anne's hands had begun to cramp. She stepped back from the rail, letting the wind brush past her. Lorna looked up. "Where are we headed?" she asked. Anne didn't answer right away. It was a question she had asked herself dozens of times since the escape. Not just where, but what? What did she want? A new ship? A quiet life on some forgotten island? Did she even have the strength for either? "I don't know," she said finally. Lorna nodded like she expected that. They didn't speak again for hours. By dawn, the clouds had cleared. The sky bled gold and lavender, the sea below it turning from charcoal to blue. Anne sat on the deck, legs stretched out in front of her. She watched the sun rise, like someone watching a fire from a distance, fascinated but not warmed. She pulled out the letter again, the one that had saved her. Its edges were frayed now, the ink smudged from salt and touch. She read it again, though she knew it by heart. You have friends still. Not many, but enough. The ship comes at the moon's dark turning. You know the code. If you can walk, you can be free. But you must choose. The handwriting was unfamiliar. No name signed at the bottom, just the faint suggestion of someone who still believed in her. She wondered who it had been. One of Calico Jack's old crew? Someone from Nassau? A governor's wife with a taste for secrets? It didn't matter. They had kept their promise. Now it was her turn to decide what came next. In the Americas, long after Anne's time, another woman faced a similar choice. Her name was Rachel Wall, born in Pennsylvania, raised a minister's daughter, turned pirate by love, or what she thought was love. Her husband had led her into it. A crew, a ship, a taste for taking what wasn't given. For a time, they succeeded. Small prizes, coastal raids. But as always, the net closed. One by one, her crew vanished. Her husband drowned in a storm. Rachel returned to Boston, tried to live quietly, but the sea had changed her. She stole again. She was caught. At her trial, she admitted to everything. I was never truly good, she said, but I was never truly evil either. They hanged her in 1789. The last words she spoke were lost to history, but the court transcript still held her plea. I only wanted to breathe. The sea breathed around Anne now, steady, patient. She rose, one hand on her belly. The child within her stirred again, a tiny nudge, a reminder. You'll have better, she whispered. Then she turned to Lorna. We head north. North? Lorna raised an eyebrow. Toward the colonies? No, past them. There's a cove near the Bahamas. I know it well. Quiet, enough trees for cover, enough fish for a while, just until, Anne looked down at her stomach, smiled faintly, until I know what kind of life I can offer. Lorna nodded, adjusted the sails, the wind shifted, and the sea, that old, merciless, forgiving mother, opened her arms again. The island emerged like a ghost on the horizon. Not with fanfare, not with jagged cliffs or towers of stone, just a dark smudge, barely separating sea from sky. As they drew closer, trees took shape, dense and low, wind bent. The beach was narrow and curved, hemmed in by jagged rocks that discouraged larger ships from getting too close. But for a small vessel like theirs, it was perfect. Anne Bonny stood at the bow, her eyes fixed on that patch of land. Her hands gripped the railing, knuckles white, not from fear, but from restraint. She longed to run, to leap, to feel solid ground under her feet again, but her body reminded her she could not. The child inside her was heavier now. Her steps were slower. Her breath came shorter. Still, she had made it. Magda brought the ship in quietly, threading the sloop through a gap in the rocks with practiced ease. Lorna stood near the mast, her eyes sweeping the tree line. There was no movement, no sign of life, just the sound of the waves pulling back against the shore like breath being held. The hull scraped softly against sand. They were here. Anne stepped down into the shallows, the warm water curling around her ankles like an embrace. She breathed in deeply and smelled green, earth, salt, life. Magda said nothing as they offloaded supplies, dried meat, a small barrel of fresh water, a coil of rope, a handful of tools. She did not offer advice or warnings, only gave Anne a long look as she handed her a small satchel, heavier than it seemed. Anne opened it. Inside, silver, maybe 30 coins, enough to barter. Anne looked up. Why? Magda shrugged. You may need it. Anne stared a moment longer, then closed the satchel and nodded. Without another word, Magda returned to the ship. She adjusted the sail. The sloop caught the breeze, turned slowly, and began to drift back out to sea. Anne watched it shrink, watched her last link to the world disappear. Then she turned inland. The island had once been used by smugglers. Anne remembered it from long ago, just a whisper of a memory, a cove spoken of in hushed tones over tankards, a place with no name, no maps, just a clearing, a freshwater spring, and a cave hidden in the rock. She and Lorna found the spring first. It burbled from beneath a twisted tree, the water cold and clear. Nearby, the cave opened like a yawning mouth. Inside, it was dry, cool, and deep enough for shelter. Someone had been here before. There were old remnants of a fire, a rusted blade, and the ghost of a rope ladder long since eaten by mold. They set to work in silence. Lorna gathered leaves for bedding. Anne lit a small fire. Their movements were slow, deliberate. Not because of fear, but because there was no longer any rush. They had time now. Precious, strange, quiet time. When the fire crackled, Anne sat beside it, hands on her belly, eyes reflecting the flame. The baby kicked once, then settled. "Did you ever think it would feel like this?" she asked. Lorna looked up. "Like what?" "Stillness." Lorna chuckled dryly. "Stillness feels like waiting. I don't trust it." Anne nodded. "Me neither." But still, it was here. Far across the Atlantic, in a city of fog and stone, a woman named Charlotte Badger once disappeared from history. Now, she had been one of the first female convicts transported from England to Australia. There, on a prison ship moored off the coast of Tasmania, she staged a mutiny, not with swords, but with cunning. Alongside a small group of fellow prisoners, she overpowered the guards, seized the ship, and vanished into the Pacific. For years, sightings were whispered across the South Seas. A pale-skinned woman commanding a sloop near Tonga. A trader in Samoa who spoke perfect English but claimed no homeland. A mother with flame-red hair raising 2 children among Maori tribes. But no record confirmed her fate. She became a story, a myth, a threat whispered to children who misbehaved. Charlotte will come for you in the night. Some said she was killed by her own crew. Others claimed she settled on a hidden island, lived quietly, and died of old age with the sea just steps from her door. Perhaps that was true. Perhaps she, like Anne, had needed only one thing, space to breathe. Anne dreamt that night. She stood on a ship with torn sails, the deck splintered and burning. A storm raged above her, lightning with no thunder, rain that tasted of ash. At the helm stood Mary Reed, her hair soaked and her eyes wild. "You made it," Mary said. "For now," Anne replied. Mary laughed. "That's all anyone ever gets." Anne reached out. "Come with me." But Mary stepped back. The deck cracked open beneath her feet. "This part's yours," she said, as the darkness swallowed her whole. Anne woke in the cave, her breath caught in her throat. The fire had burned low. Outside, the leaves rustled with a gentle breeze. Lorna slept nearby, her back to the wall, a hand resting on the hilt of a blade she refused to let go of. Anne touched her stomach. The baby was still. She lay back and watched the cave ceiling. It was strange, she thought, how survival could feel like morning. Over the next days, they built. Not a home, not yet, but shelter. A canopy of woven branches. A place to cook, a place to sleep. Lorna fished with a spear made from driftwood. Anne gathered wild fruit and boiled herbs she half remembered from her childhood. Time slowed. The sea remained. And every night, Anne sat by the fire and wondered if this was her punishment or her reward. To live when others did not. To raise a child in silence. To remember everything and speak of nothing. But one night, as the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, she whispered into the dark, "I will tell you, someday, all of it." The wind passed through the trees in answer, and the sea kept breathing. The days melted together like wax in the sun. The island, once a blur of green and rock, had begun to take shape in Anne Bonny's mind, not just as a place, but as a rhythm. Morning began with the call of birds she couldn't name, sharp and brief like arrows loosed into the sky. The heat climbed slowly like a rising tide, and with it came the work, fetching water, sorting through root vegetables, clearing the underbrush from around the cave. Lorna spoke little, but Anne had grown to understand her silence. She was not cold, she was watchful, precise. Every movement was chosen, every glance measured, but she had a softness too, hidden beneath years of iron. She would leave berries beside Anne's sleeping mat. She would sit with her after dark, watching the fire without speaking, her presence a quiet guard against the dark. Anne, for her part, began to feel the change in her body more acutely. The baby was growing. Her back ached now in a dull, persistent way. Her ankles swelled after long walks. But her spirit, strange as it seemed, had begun to settle. For the first time in her life, she wasn't thinking about the next port, the next raid, the next escape. There was only now, only here. At night, when she lay on her side, she would whisper to the child inside her. Not stories, not yet, just pieces of things. Words she remembered from songs, the smell of sea smoke, the way rum warmed the throat after a hard wind, the sound of Mary Reed's laughter when they'd stolen a captain's boots and left a note in his hat. For every foot that tramples may one go bare. Anne often wondered if she had the right to remember those things, to speak them, to claim them when so many had died with nothing left but silence. Far away, in a century yet to come, another woman named Fatima al-Sabi would speak her own memories into the sea. She was born in Zanzibar, a place of perfume and pearl divers, and married at 13 to a merchant twice her age. When he died of a fever or poison, the stories varied, she took his ships, not by inheritance, by will. Fatima had a mind like a compass. She navigated trade winds with an instinct owned from watching sailors who had never seen a woman give orders, but she gave them, and they obeyed. For a time, she grew rich on spices, textiles, and whispers. Then came the Portuguese, their guns louder, their greed hungrier. Fatima turned her fleet from commerce to resistance. Not piracy, she insisted, justice. Her ships moved swiftly along the eastern coast of Africa, striking where the colonizers grew fat and slow. She never left survivors who bore arms, but spared the slaves and servants, often offering them a place among her crew. Eventually, her name drew too much light. She fled to a hidden atoll near Madagascar, where she is said to have lived out her years in a bamboo house filled with maps and music. No one recorded her death, but fishermen still find driftwood carved with her initials, carried by the currents like messages from the deep. Anne stood at the edge of the island one morning, looking out at the sea as if expecting a reply. Her feet were bare, toes sinking into warm sand. The sun was soft then, the sky a pale peach that hadn't yet turned to flame. "I used to dream of this," she said aloud. Lorna was behind her, sharpening a blade against stone. "A beach?" Lorna asked. Anne smiled faintly. "Not the place, the quiet." Lorna paused her work. "And now that you have it?" Anne turned. Her eyes weren't sad, but they were tired. "I don't know if I deserve it." Lorna didn't answer immediately. She set the blade down and came to stand beside her. "I don't think it's about deserve," she said. "It's just about what's next." Anne let those words hang in the air. What was next? One evening, as the firelight flickered against the cave walls, Anne told a story. Not a big one, just a fragment. "There was a ship," she said, "called the Revenge, not the one you've heard of. Ours was small, fast. The figurehead was a crow carved from ebony. I never knew who made it. It had no eyes." Lorna listened, silent, the fire dancing in her eyes. "We raided a French merchant off the coast of Eleuthera. They never saw us coming. We took everything, sugar, coin, charts. I found a journal in the captain's cabin. It was full of poetry. Bad poetry, but it was about the sea, about missing home. I kept it for weeks." "What happened to it?" Lorna asked. Anne stirred the fire. "Threw it overboard after Mary died." Lorna nodded. "Sometimes we have to let things go." Anne looked at her. "Even the good things?" Lorna didn't answer. That night, Anne dreamed again. She stood on the gallows, a noose around her neck, but no crowd below. Only water. Endless, black water. The rope snapped and she fell, not with fear but with relief. The fall took forever, and when she landed, it was not pain she felt, but breath. Deep, cold, clean breath. She awoke to a breeze against her face, and something else. The first pain, not sharp, not sudden, but deep, low, rising. She sat up slowly. Lorna stirred beside her. "It's starting," Anne whispered. Lorna was awake in a moment. No panic, no surprise. She moved to Anne's side and took her hand. "Then it's time," she said. Anne nodded. Outside, the wind rose, and the island held its breath. The cave walls caught every sound. The first cry of pain echoed like a memory returning from far away. Anne Bonny sat on the bedding of leaves and torn cloth, her back pressed to the stone, sweat beading on her brow though the night was cool. Her breathing had grown shallow, urgent. Between each contraction, she tried to rest, just for a second, just enough to stay conscious, stay centered. Lorna crouched beside her, hands steady, voice low and calm. "Breathe," she said. "Let it pass." Then again. Anne gritted her teeth and nodded. Her hair clung to her face. Her hands trembled. She had faced blades, storms, betrayals, but this pain was different. This was not something to fight, but something to endure. There was no escape, only through. The fire flickered low. A bowl of water sat beside it, warmed, ready. Lorna had boiled herbs earlier, a bitter mix for pain and blood. She moved between Anne's legs, checking for progress, her face a mask of focus. "It's close," she said, "but it'll take time." Anne let her head fall back. She stared up at the roof of the cave, dark and unmoving. The stone above her looked eternal, unchanging, and yet here she was, breaking open beneath it. In the days of the Barbary corsairs, there was a woman known only as Daria, the sea. Born to a Turkish fisherman and a Greek captive, she had known hardship from the womb. Sold as a child to a wealthy merchant, she escaped before her 12th year, stowing away on a pirate ship disguised as a boy. Over time, her deception was revealed, but by then her place had been earned. She was ruthless with a blade and merciful with the broken. Her loyalty was fierce, her wrath cold. Men followed her not because she demanded it, but because she fought at the front. Her story might have ended like so many others, on the gallows or in a battle lost. But Daria disappeared. No records of capture, no evidence of death, only a rumor that she had settled on a remote island with a child in her arms, that she became a healer, that she buried her sword in the roots of an olive tree and never spoke of war again. In one village along the North African coast, there is still a shrine, not marked with her name, but with a symbol, a woman holding the sea in her hands. Another contraction, stronger this time. Anne let out a moan she couldn't suppress. Lorna moved quickly, supporting her, wiping her brow. "You're doing fine," she said. "You've been through worse." Anne laughed, but it came out broken. "Not like this." "No," Lorna admitted, "not like this." Hours passed in slow agony. The cave felt smaller with each cry. Anne's voice grew hoarse, her strength waned. At times she drifted, half asleep, half conscious, somewhere between this world and the next. And then, there it was, the crowning, the rush, the final, unbearable push. And then, silence. A silence so complete, so total, that it stole Anne's breath. Lorna was still. Then came a sound. Not Anne's, not Lorna's, but a high, wet, fragile cry. Life. Anne turned her head slowly, vision blurred, heart stilled. Lorna knelt in the firelight, holding a small, squirming bundle in her arms, coated in blood and warmth and newness. "It's a girl," she whispered. Anne didn't speak. She only reached out. Lorna placed the baby in her arms, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Bonny wept, not for loss, not for pain, but for joy. The child was small, too small perhaps, but her cry was strong. Her limbs moved freely. Her eyes, though barely open, seemed to catch the flicker of the fire as if already remembering it. Anne held her close, skin to skin, breath to breath. "She has fire in her," Lorna said. Anne nodded. "She has ghosts too." They sat in silence for a while. Eventually, Anne spoke again. "Mary would have loved her." Lorna didn't reply. "She only added wood to the fire and made a tea of herbs to help with the bleeding." Outside, the wind had calmed. The waves whispered. A new day had not yet begun, but something had. In the West Indies, there is a tale passed from mother to daughter, never written, only spoken when the stars are out and the waves are gentle. It tells of a red-haired pirate woman who gave birth in a cave with only the sea to bless the child. The story says that the child grew strong, that she became a sailor, then a smuggler, then a legend. Some say she never left the island. Others say she sails still, aboard a ship with no name, her flag bearing the image of a bird in flight. But none who tell the story can say how it ends, only that it began with a cry, and a woman who once lost found herself again in the arms of her daughter. Bonny closed her eyes. The child slept now, curled against her like a second heart, and for the first time in a lifetime, Anne let herself sleep too. The days after the birth blurred together like watercolor in rain. Bonny remained in the cave, wrapped in a haze of exhaustion, pain, and a strange, delicate peace. Her body ached in ways that went beyond bruises or wounds. It was the ache of rearrangement, of life being pulled from within her, and the hollow afterward being seen slowly stitched shut by time. The baby, wrapped in soft cloth and warmed by Anne's skin, slept in fits and bursts. When she woke, it was with tiny cries, piercing but not angry, more like questions asked into the darkness. Anne answered everyone in silence, with touch, with closeness, with the steady beat of her heart against the child's ear. Lorna kept to her tasks. She caught fish, boiled roots, patched the roof of their lean-to. She never asked if Anne needed help. She simply offered it without a word, sliding broth into Anne's hands, lifting the child when Anne's arms trembled too hard to hold her. Each evening, they sat by the fire and said nothing. The flames were their only conversation, crackling softly, casting long shadows on the stone. By the fourth night, Anne whispered a name, Rosa. Lorna raised an eyebrow but didn't question it. Anne stroked the child's fine dark hair. Mary once told me that name meant hope growing in thorns, or maybe she just liked the sound of it. She'd approve, Lorna said. Anne smiled faintly. She always said pirates shouldn't have children. Too cruel a world, too much blood. And yet, Lorna murmured. Here she is. Elsewhere, long ago, a woman named Jacques Delahaye had faced the same contradiction. Born in Saint-Domingue to a French father and a Haitian mother, Jacques lost her family in a raid while still a girl. With nothing left, she took to the sea disguised as a man, working her way onto a crew, then rising among them, not by deceit but by courage. When her true identity was discovered, it didn't matter. Her skill with pistols and her daring during raids earned her the loyalty of men who once laughed at her. She became known as Back from the Dead Red, after rumors spread that she had faked her own death to escape capture and returned 2 years later to reclaim her ship. But even legends grow tired. In her final years, Jacques is said to have found a small island. She built a home from shipwrecked wood, raised goats, planted fruit trees, and some say raised a son, a quiet boy who grew into a fierce sailor, never knowing the world had once trembled at his mother's name. She died without chains, without a trial, without even a headline. Only a tree near the shore bears her initials, carved in deep, JD plus the shape of a flame. On their island, Anne began to walk again, slowly at first. Her legs shook, her back throbbed, but she moved clutching Rosa close enough, whispering old sea shanties as lullabies. Lorna built a hammock from woven branches and vines, hung it near the mouth of the cave, where the breeze was gentle and the light golden. Rosa slept there most afternoons, her tiny hands curled into fists, her breath steady. Anne sat nearby, carving. She had found a flat piece of driftwood and taken to it with a small knife Magda had left behind, not to make a weapon, just to make something. She carved a bird, not a dove, not a hawk, something in between. One morning, a storm rolled over the island. It wasn't fierce, but it came fast, with thick gray clouds and rain that hissed on the leaves. Lorna secured the food. Anne gathered Rosa close and held her in the deepest part of the cave. The baby cried at first, then fell quiet, soothed by Anne's humming, songs half remembered from a ship long gone. Anne looked out into the rain and felt the strangest thing, gratitude, not because the storm had passed, but because she had survived it. That night, after the storm, they found a bird at the edge of the trees. Its wing was broken. Lorna would have ended it quickly, with kindness, but Anne stopped her. Let me try. She brought the bird into the cave, fed it water, wrapped its wing with strips of cloth, sat with it while Rosa slept beside her. The bird stared at her, not with fear, but with the blank, heavy stare of a creature too tired to flee. You're not the only one who fell, Anne whispered. In the weeks that followed, the island began to feel like more than a hiding place. Fruit ripened on trees they hadn't noticed before. A spring of water bubbled further inland, fresher than the stream they'd first found. Lorna discovered an old wooden chest beneath a patch of overgrowth. Inside were rotted linens, a rusted sextant, and a small jar of dried herbs, still fragrant after years. Anne added the sextant to her carving. Now the bird had a sky. Rosa grew stronger. Her eyes opened more each day, deep brown, calm. She doesn't cry much, Lorna remarked one night. No, Anne said, she listens. They fell into silence again. This time it was peaceful. But Anne knew peace could not last forever. She knew the sea, and the sea always remembers. She had once stood trial beneath the gaze of judges who spoke her name like a curse. She had once stood on deck soaked with blood and salt. Her name had been shouted in terror and in song. Now it lived only in whispers. But whispers travel, especially when carried by the wind, especially when the past refuses to stay buried. Anne stood on the beach at dusk, Rosa wrapped against her chest. The waves lapped at her feet, and in the distance she thought, just for a moment, she saw a sail. Anne did not speak of the sail she had seen. Not that night, and not the next. It could have been a cloud, she told herself. A trick of light. Her eyes still tired, her mind still steeped in the ghost thoughts that came after birth, visions that danced between memory and fear. But the image clung to her, a triangle of white against the horizon, too rigid to be missed, too still to be waved. She rose earlier each morning now, stood longer at the water's edge, Rosa tied close to her chest with cloth, sleeping beneath her chin. Lorna noticed the change but asked nothing. She was not one to press until the silence grew too thick to ignore. Anne didn't let it. I saw a sail, she said 3 days later. Lorna stopped slicing the root vegetables. She didn't look up, didn't ask when or how far. Close, she said. No, not yet. Lorna nodded, but they'll come. It wasn't a question. Anne sat slowly, shifting Rosa to her lap. We always knew they would. Not always, Lorna replied. Just since you named the child. Anne smiled faintly. You think names bring attention? I think names make things real, and real things get noticed. In the harbor towns of Nova Scotia, there was once a tale of a woman called Black Meg. No one knew her birth name. She appeared after a French ship was wrecked in a sudden squall, and survivors washed ashore in ones and twos. Among them was a woman with hair dark as pitch and eyes that saw through lies like lanterns through fog. She claimed no flag, carried no arms. But within weeks, she had a crew. They followed her not because of her skill with a blade, though she had that too, but because she never asked for trust, only truth. Black Meg raided quietly. She struck only when the moon was high and the sea was low. She stole no more than she needed. She left the sick with medicine. She buried the dead herself. One night, she vanished. A ship, some say, British. Others say she walked into the woods one morning with a satchel of maps and never returned. But on full moon nights, fisher folk near the cliffs swear they hear a low whistle drifting over the water. 3 notes, sharp and sweet. They say it's a warning. They say she still watches. Anne and Lorna prepared not with urgency, but with a kind of quiet ritual. They didn't speak of war. There were no battle plans, no drawn blades. Only small acts, repairing the outer shelter, gathering extra roots, watching the sky for smoke. Lorna began checking the cove each dawn. She hid tracks with fallen leaves, removed signs of cooking fire from the beach. She cut back the ferns near the freshwater spring and rewrapped their supplies in oilcloth. Anne did what she could. She boiled water, sorted cloth, sat with Rosa and told her stories, not of pirates, but of wind and birds and the names of stars. That night she carved another symbol into the driftwood bird, a small crescent moon behind its wing. I don't know what we're waiting for, she said. You're not waiting, Lorna replied. You're remembering. Anne glanced up. You always speak in riddles. No, Lorna said, her voice softer now. I speak like someone who's run out of lies. It came on the 5th night, a distant light, not fire, not stars, but the slow swing of a lantern swaying from the mast of a ship that didn't belong. Lorna saw it first. She watched it from the ridge near the western bluff, then slipped back into the cave like a shadow wearing skin. They've anchored just outside the reef, she said. Anne stood. Colors? None flown. Merchant? No. They stared at each other in the half-dark, Rosa sleeping between them. Anne's mind raced, not with panic, but with calculation. If they were here for supplies, they might stay a day. If they were pirates, they might not care who lived on the island. But if they were looking for her, we don't run, Anne said. No, Lorna agreed. We vanish. They packed in silence. Not everything, just what mattered. Food for a few days. The sling for Rosa, the knife, the sextant, Anne's carving, and a small pouch of coin. Lorna carried the rest. Together they made for the far side of the island, where cliffs dipped into narrow trails and the underbrush was too thick for horses, too silent for boots. They hid in the upper grove for 3 days, saw nothing, heard little. Then, on the 3rd night, distant voices, men, drunk perhaps, or angry. The kind of voices Anne remembered from docks and taverns, always seeking something to control, something to punish. A tree split under a blade, a shout echoed. Then silence. Anne held Rosa close, breath slow and shallow. They did not come farther, but they had been close enough. On the 4th day, Lorna went scouting. She returned at dusk with a hard set to her jaw. Gone, she said. Ship's not at anchor anymore. No tracks past the grove. Just looking? Anne asked. Lorna shook her head. They didn't find what they wanted. Anne glanced down at Rosa, who gurgled softly in her arms. Then they'll be back. Lorna didn't deny it. That night, Anne placed the carved bird on the cave wall. Beside it, she scratched a new line. Still flying. No one else would know what it meant. No one else needed to. Rosa slept. The fire whispered, and the sea, ever watchful, wrapped the island in its arms once more. The days that followed passed with a newfound tension, unspoken, but felt in the way Lorna stepped a little quieter, in the way Anne kept her knife closer when she slept, in the way the fire was allowed to die lower at night, the smoke kept thinner, more cautious. The ship had left, but the presence it brought lingered like a damp cloth over the island. Anne knew the sea too well to believe in coincidence. Someone had been searching, And if they had not found what they wanted, they would try again. But for now, the ocean returned to its rhythms, and so did they. Rosa was growing. Her cries were stronger now, her fists more curious. She watched the world with a calm intensity, her gaze following birds, leaves, the flicker of flame. Anne sometimes wondered if Rosa could already sense what kind of world she'd been born into, if children knew the taste of danger before they learned the sound of their own names. Anne sang to her, not lullabies, not proper ones, just scraps of song, verses half remembered from ships and shorelines, stories turned into rhythm. There once was a lass with fire in her hair, and trouble behind her everywhere. She danced on the deck with a cutlass bright, and vanished again in the silver night. Rosa didn't understand the words, but she listened, always listened. In the southern reaches of the Indian Ocean, there had once been another woman who knew how to vanish. They called her Sarita of the Silent Reef. She sailed alone for years. Her ship, the Gossamer, was small but fast, its sails the color of bone. No crew was ever seen aboard, though supplies were often found stored on deck. Some claimed she had once led a great fleet, but watched it burn from a mountaintop after a betrayal too deep to forgive. Others said she was the daughter of a drowned merchant, raised by coral and sharks, who never spoke a word in her life. She was known not for what she took, but for what she left behind: coins pressed into the mouths of slain captains, coral charms hung from broken masts, and once, the carved image of a woman with her eyes closed placed on a stone altar in a deserted port. Sarita was never captured, never tried, never named in any naval ledger. But pearl divers off the Maldives still tell of a sail that glides without sound near the reefs, seen only in the hush before dawn. Some say she sails with the ghosts of her crew. Others say she never needed one. Anne rose earlier than usual one morning and found Lorna already gone from the cave. She stepped out into the mist, Rosa bundled against her chest, and walked toward the cove. She found Lorna there, crouched near the water, her hands running over the sand like she was reading it. Anne approached quietly. They came ashore again, Lorna said without turning. Anne's pulse slowed. When? Last night. 2, maybe 3 men. No torches, no fire. Did they leave tracks? Lorna nodded. I followed them to the edge of the ridge. Then they turned back. Scouting. Lorna stood slowly, looking for someone who doesn't want to be found. Anne's fingers tightened on Rosa's blanket. She looked out at the sea. Only waves, only light, but in her gut something coiled. They'll come back, she said. Lorna didn't argue. That night Anne couldn't sleep. She held Rosa close and watched the fire die down. Each flicker of shadow on the wall looked like motion, each creak of tree or branch a footfall. She remembered the prison again, the silence of stone, the letter hidden beneath her mattress. You must choose. She had chosen this, freedom, but she knew now that freedom never meant safety. She rose quietly, stepping over the stones until she reached the driftwood carving. She added another mark, 3 lines like sails, fading into the horizon. Rosa stirred against her. Anne whispered, if they come, we don't run. The next day they prepared, not for battle, but for movement. They buried supplies in sealed pots, dug a second fire pit deep in the woods, marked a trail with shells and bark that only they would understand. Every step was quiet, measured. Each plan spoken only once, then sealed with a nod. At midday, a gull circled overhead. It cried out once, shrill, clear. Anne looked up and smiled. Even the sky's watching, she said. Lorna glanced at Rosa, who stared at the bird, unblinking. She'll be strong, Lorna said. Anne nodded. Anne nodded. She already is. That night, a storm rolled in again. Not hard, just steady. It cloaked the island, and a curtain of rain made the trees hiss like whispering mouths. Anne held Rosa close. Lorna stood at the entrance of the cave, blade in hand. They waited, not with fear, but with the quiet patience of women who have survived too much to flinch at shadows. Outside, the wind moaned low, but the sea, always the sea, kept breathing. The rain fell through the night, steady as a drumbeat, tapping on the leaves, pattering on the stone. It did not roar or rage, it whispered, a soft warning, a gentle prelude. Inside the cave, Anne sat with Rosa nestled against her chest. The fire was out, but the warmth of the earth and the slow rise and fall of Anne's breath kept the baby quiet. Her tiny hand gripped the edge of Anne's tunic, curled fingers like the closing of a blossom. Lorna remained at the entrance, her back against the stone, blade across her lap. Her eyes never closed. She did not speak. She simply listened, to the rain, to the branches, to the occasional hush of something moving through the undergrowth. They had learned, both of them, that silence had layers, that peace could wear the shape of stillness but hide a knife beneath. The island tonight was not peaceful. It was holding its breath. In the dark waters between Corsica and Sardinia, there once sailed a woman called Elisabetta, though no one remembered her full name. She was born to a family of sailors, raised with salt in her veins and grief in her bones. Her brothers had been pressed into service by a Genoese warship. They never returned. Her father was lost to a debt he could never repay. Elisabetta took to the sea not to escape, but to avenge. Her ship was made from the bones of an old merchant brig, painted black, its sails patched with canvas stolen from her enemies. She did not call herself a captain. Her crew did not call her anything at all. They followed her because she spoke with clarity, because she never blinked when blood was drawn. When she was finally captured, it was not in battle, but in sleep. A man she trusted slit her throat in the night, seeking a pardon from the crown. But she did not die. She survived, barely, escaped, and vanished. Years later, sailors swore they saw her again, older, slower, but alive, tending a garden on a cliff above the sea. When asked her name, she said nothing, only raised a finger to her lips, smiled, and disappeared among the olive trees. Anne didn't sleep that night. Not really. Her eyes closed, but her thoughts spun in quiet circles. She remembered Nassau, the brothels and the taverns, the smell of gunpowder and grease, the taste of freedom so thick it coated your teeth like molasses. She remembered laughter, Mary's, Jack's, her own. She remembered pain, the way the chains bit her wrists when she was dragged from the courtroom, the smell of prison straw, the slow, steady death of hope. And then she remembered the letter, the ship, the cave, Rosa. It had all led here, to this moment, to this hush before something changed. Dawn came in pieces. First, the gray glow behind the clouds, then the lifting of the mist from the trees. Finally, the wind, shifting from warm to sharp, as if tasting the air for news. Lorna stirred first. She stepped to the cave entrance and peered out, then turned. They're here. Anne rose, already tying Rosa to her chest with practiced care. Her body was sore, her limbs stiff, but her movements were precise. She slung the small pouch of coins over her shoulder, slipped the knife into her belt. They didn't speak. There was no need. They moved through the trees like shadows. Lorna led, clearing branches, choosing quiet ground. Anne followed, every step measured, Rosa tight against her chest, her breathing matched to the rustle of wind through leaves. The path they'd marked with shells and bark led them to a narrow ridge overlooking the cove. And there it was, the ship, sleek, silent, black hull, no flags, no colors, but its shape was unmistakable, fast, ruthless, designed for pursuit. On the shore below, 3 men stood. One held a musket, another paced. The third knelt, examining footprints in the sand. They were not merchants. They were hunters. Anne crouched low, heart thudding. Lorna whispered, "They've been watching longer than we thought." "Too long," Anne replied. "Could have taken us in the cave." "They didn't." Anne nodded. "They want her alive." She touched Rosa's sleeping cheek. The baby stirred but didn't wake. Lorna's eyes narrowed. "Then we don't let them have her." Anne looked at the ocean beyond the ship, its surface glassy and gray. "I have an idea," she said softly. Lorna smiled grimly. "I was afraid you'd say that." By mid-morning, the men had moved inland. Anne and Lorna doubled back through the undergrowth, silent and quick. They reached the far end of the cove by midday and found what they were hoping for, a battered rowboat half buried in the sand. One oar was cracked, the hull scarred, but it floated. They worked fast. Anne patched the seam with wax and resin. Lorna replaced the broken oar with a branch. They didn't need it to last forever, only long enough. At dusk, the plan began. Anne took the boat out alone, just far enough to be seen, a lantern in her hand, a shape in the surf. She made no effort to hide. From the trees, the hunters saw her, and just as she hoped, they gave chase. As the black-hulled ship moved to intercept, Lorna slipped through the shadows with Rosa. She climbed the trail Anne had shown her, up the ridge, over the rocks, to a hidden inlet on the far side of the island. There, a second boat waited, smaller, covered in netting, meant for fishing. Anne had hidden it weeks ago, just in case. Anne never let them catch her. She veered at the last moment, dashed the lantern on the rocks, let the darkness swallow her as she turned the boat into the currents. They searched for hours, but she had already vanished. By the time the hunters returned to shore, the cave was empty. The fire was cold, and the sea quiet, as if it had swallowed every trace. Far from the island, beneath a canopy of stars, Anne found the hidden inlet. Lorna waited. Rosa slept. They didn't speak. Anne stepped into the boat, held her daughter close, and together under the weight of silence and starlight, they pushed off. The sea opened wide before them and carried them forward once again into the unknown. The current was slow, but steady. It carried them away from the island like a hand guiding something delicate through the dark, silent, unseen, certain. The stars above offered no promises, only presence. Pinpricks of light scattered across an endless sky, reflecting in the water like 1,000 watching eyes. Anne rowed when she could. Lorna took turns, her strokes deliberate, her eyes always on the horizon. The patched boat creaked with every movement, a tired vessel bearing women who had carried too much for too long. Rosa slept through the first night. Her tiny breaths rose and fell against Anne's chest, her warmth grounding the hours between dusk and dawn. Anne didn't sleep. Not really. She drifted in and out, head bowed, thoughts flickering. She didn't think of the men on the black-holed ship. She didn't think of whether they would return to the island or if others might come. She thought only of movement, of going forward, of surviving once more. They reached another island by the next evening. It was larger, flatter. No towering cliffs or hidden caves, just mangroves and low trees and a shore of gray stones that clicked underfoot when they landed. No smoke, no signs of life, no names. Lorna scouted ahead, silent as ever. Anne waited at the waterline, holding Rosa close, whispering to her as the waves licked at their toes. "You were born on the edge of the world," she murmured, "where the sea meets the stone and the birds cry like they've seen too much." Rosa blinked slowly, as if she understood. Lorna returned before nightfall. "Clear," she said. "There's a grove inland, water, some shelter." Anne nodded. They would stay only a night. Far from them, in a time not yet past, there would live another woman who knew what it meant to move from place to place, not because she wished to explore, but because standing still was dangerous. Her name was Nia, born in Bengal, stolen at 14 by raiders, sold in pieces, first to merchants, then to a privateer captain who saw in her not just a captive, but a threat. She learned his routes, listened to his men. One night, she slit his throat with a fishbone and took his ship. They never saw her coming. Nia never claimed revenge as her purpose. She never flew a flag. She sailed under the cover of storms and traded in places no map recorded. Her crew were all women, each with a past burned too deep to forget. They were called ghosts. And when their ship, the Vanta, was finally found wrecked on a reef with no bodies aboard, the rumors began. They hadn't drowned. They had simply walked into the fog and vanished. Some said Nia still wandered the sea, barefoot, whispering to the wind, a prayer or a promise. Anne and Lorna built no fire that night. The stars were enough. Anne sat beneath a tree. Rosa nestled against her, her small hands opening and closing as though reaching for dreams. Lorna leaned back against the bark, blade in her lap, head tilted toward the sky. "You think it'll ever stop?" Anne asked. Lorna glanced sideways. "What?" "The running, the hiding." Lorna considered it for a moment. "I think if it does, it won't be because the world changed." Anne looked down at Rosa. "Then why?" "Because we did." By morning, they were back on the water. The boat was holding like though the patched seam wept slightly with each wave. Anne kept an eye on it. They'd need to find a proper port soon, someplace quiet, unbothered, where a name meant nothing and questions were impolite. The wind shifted. Lorna adjusted the sail they had rigged from torn canvas. Rosa was quieter that day, eyes open, watching the water as it moved alongside them, fascinated by its glint and rhythm. Anne watched her, remembering the first time she'd seen the sea, not through the eyes of a mother or a fugitive, but as a girl, hungry, burning, wild. And yet here she was, still floating, not by strength alone, but by choice. In a quiet port north of Tortuga, years later, a woman would arrive with a child on her hip and a pouch of coins she never opened in public. She would wear a hat too large for her face and speak with the soft lilt of islands far away. She would buy a cottage near the cliffs, sell herbs in the market, and never offer her surname. Some would wonder, Some would whisper, but no one would ask, because in her silence, there was something deeper than mystery. There was history. For now, Anne watched the coast ahead grow nearer. Not a city, not yet, just the shape of land. Possibility. She reached out and placed her hand on Rosa's head, her fingers resting gently against the soft fuzz of her hair. "You're not what I expected," she whispered. The baby blinked, "but you're exactly what I needed." The wind filled their sails, and the boat, though small, sailed on. The coast they approached rose gently from the sea, a long, curving beach flanked by windswept palms and soft, sloping hills. No smoke curled from chimneys, no boats bobbed in harbor. It was not a settlement, not even a village, just a stretch of land where the earth seemed to have paused, waiting for someone to arrive. Anne steered the boat toward the narrowest part of the beach. Lorna stood, eyes scanning the tree line, her hand resting on the hilt of her knife. Rosa slept against Anne's chest, the steady rocking of the waves lulling her deeper with each breath. When they landed, the boat scraped softly against the shore. Anne stepped out first, boots sinking into wet sand. The wind tugged at her hair, now tangled and streaked with salt. She felt the strain in her limbs, the pull in her back, but her feet were steady. Her gaze was sharp. Lorna pulled the boat up past the tide line, anchoring it between two smooth boulders. "If we need it again," she said. Anne nodded. "We always might." They moved inland slowly. The beach gave way to tall grass, dotted with flowering shrubs and low, gnarled trees. The scent of the sea clung to everything, but beneath it was the smell of green things, sap, earth, and wild fruit not yet fallen. By mid-morning they found a freshwater spring, not as large as the one on the last island, but enough, clear and sweet. The sound of it was soft, like laughter hidden in the underbrush. They built a small shelter between two leaning palms, draped with palm fronds and stitched together sailcloth. Enough for sleep, enough for now. Anne laid Rosa down in a cradle of blankets, watching as the child stretched and cooed in her sleep. Lorna sat nearby, sharpening her blade with the same slow rhythm she always used. Not out of fear, out of habit. "You think anyone's been here?" Anne asked. "Maybe, but not recently." "Good." They didn't say it, but they both felt it. This place was not home. Not yet, but it could be. In the highlands of Brazil, deep within the forest, there once lived a woman named Marisol. She had been born in chains, carried across the Atlantic in the dark belly of a ship, sold, beaten, branded. She had every reason to hate the sea. But one night, during a monsoon, she slipped her bonds, stole a boat, and drifted downstream until the river opened its mouth to the ocean. No one knows how long she was at sea or how she survived. But she did. She washed ashore in a forgotten inlet, half starved, half dead, but alive. And there she began again. She built a life from ash and clay, raised children, planted gardens, taught others who came after how to live quietly, safely. When Portuguese soldiers finally found the settlement decades later, they found only ruins, vines wrapped around old walls, carvings in stone, a shrine to a woman with fire in her eyes and waves at her feet. They never found a body, only footprints leading back toward the sea. Anne walked the new land each day. She learned its sounds, the rustle of lizards in the grass, the chirp of birds that lived only in the canopy, the hum of insects at dusk. She picked wild fruit and tasted cautiously. Some were sweet, others bitter. A few she marked to avoid. Rosa began to smile more often, small, sudden expressions that bloomed and faded like morning sunlight. She reached for Anne's fingers, for the leaves above her, for Lorna's hair, which she found endlessly fascinating. Anne spoke to her constantly. "Do you see that bird? Bright like fire, always in a hurry. Feel the wind? That's your grandmother's breath, I think. She's watching. You were born in a cave, my love, but you'll walk in the sun." At night, Anne carved. She had found a piece of driftwood shaped like a wing. She smoothed it carefully, working it with a small shard of bone in the edge of a shell. She carved not a bird this time, but a woman, tall, cloaked, holding a child in one arm and the sea in the other. When Lorna saw it, she said nothing, but she moved it to the center of the shelter, resting it near the sleeping mat. A quiet altar. On the fifth night, Anne woke suddenly, not to sound, but to stillness. The air had gone cold. Rosa whimpered in her sleep, then fell silent again. Anne rose and stepped outside. The moon was high, full in her, casting light over the beach like a pale flame. There, at the edge of the water, stood a figure. Anne froze. She didn't call out, didn't draw a weapon. The figure turned slowly. It was a woman, dressed in dark cloth, her face veiled by shadow, her hands bare. She looked at Anne with something between sorrow and recognition. Anne blinked, and the woman was gone. No footprints, no sound, just the waves washing in and out like breath. Anne stared a long time, then turned back toward the shelter. Rosa was awake, watching her, eyes wide, calm. Anne bent down and whispered, "We were seen tonight." Rosa blinked. Anne kissed her forehead, and I think she meant us no harm. In the legends of the Lesser Antilles, there is a tale of a woman called La Dama de la Marea, the Lady of the Tide. They say she appears to women who have lost everything, but only once they have chosen to live. Not to survive, to live. They say she comes when the past no longer chases, but watches, when the sea does not threaten, but waits. They say she leaves no footprints, only blessings. Anne did not believe in ghosts, but that night, she slept without her knife, and Rosa did not cry. The morning after the Lady of the Tide appeared, the world felt quieter, not empty, not silent, but still in a way that Anne had not known since she was a child, hiding under the wide skirts of the cook's wife back in Charlestown, listening to storms batter the roof while pretending the thunder was laughter. The waves rolled in softer, the wind barely stirred. Even the birds seemed to sing in lower tones, as though the island itself had seen something sacred and didn't dare interrupt its passing. Anne rose early. Rosa lay curled in sleep, one hand fisted near her cheek, lips twitching with dreams. Anne brushed a kiss across her daughter's forehead and stepped out into the light, barefoot, letting the damp sand cool the heat of her bones. Lorna was already down by the beach. She stood knee-deep in the water, her blade strapped to her back, spear in hand, the slow tide washing around her legs like silk. Anne joined her wordlessly, stepping beside her into the surf. They stood together, facing the horizon. "You saw her too," Anne said after a long silence. Lorna didn't look at her. Yes, she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Anne nodded. The tide lapped at their ankles. "She wasn't warning us," Anne added. "No, she was, passing through." Anne looked up at the sky. It felt like being chosen. Lorna's face softened just a little. "Maybe we were." By midday, the stillness had begun to shift. Birds returned to their noisy ways, diving and squabbling among the trees. The breeze picked up, tugging gently at the canopy. Anne bathed Rosa in the spring, singing softly to her, the tune older than memory. Rosa splashed, kicked, and laughed, a sound so new to the world it felt like the island itself paused to listen. That night, Anne added a new carving to her small collection. This one was simple, a wave, curling. Within it, a sleeping face. She didn't tell Lorna what it meant. She didn't have to. Far away, in a different lifetime, in the bustling port city of Luanda, there lived a woman named Io. She had been raised among scholars, trained in languages and trade, born into a family that moved between empires like ships through fog. But when the slave traders came for her younger brother, she took up arms, not to fight a war, to buy time. She joined a crew of exiles and escaped slaves. They raided Portuguese ships along the western coast of Africa, not for gold, but for the stolen. They freed hundreds. Io became a myth, a woman who spoke 7 tongues and wielded a dagger carved from whalebone, a woman who negotiated with kings and cut down slavers in the same breath. She was never caught, but one day she stopped sailing. She built a school in a hidden valley, taught every child who came, left no sign of what she had been, only a name etched above the doorway, Iona Ebube. I am glory. Anne thought of Io often in those days, though she had only ever heard her name whispered by passing sailors in backwater taverns. She thought of all the women who had come before her, who had bled and sailed and hidden and fought, not for crowns, not for riches, but for breath, for one more breath, for the right to choose what came next. She didn't know what came next for her, but she was no longer afraid to ask. On the 7th night after the storm, Rosa stood for the first time, not fully, not long, just a wobble on her mother's lap, feet pressing against Anne's thighs, hands reaching forward, eyes wide with determination. Anne laughed aloud, the sound echoing off the rocks like bells in an empty church. "She's already braver than I was," she said. Lorna, crouched by the fire, looked up with a rare smile. "She's yours." "No," Anne said. "She's hers." She didn't say who, but the wind that passed through the trees seemed to understand. They began to talk of leaving, not from fear, from purpose. This island gave us time, Anne said one evening, but it's not where we end. Lorna agreed. There's always another shore. I want her to see the world, Anne whispered, watching Rosa sleep. She will. Anne turned toward her. Will you come with us? Lorna met her gaze. Until I don't need to. They clasped hands, not tightly, not formally, just enough. In a port town on the edge of the Yucatan, there would one day arrive a woman with a child, in a story she never told the same way twice. Some nights she said she'd escaped a naval prison. Other times she claimed she was born on a thunderstorm and raised by birds. She taught the children there how to read the tides. She taught the women how to hide knives in their sleeves. And she named her daughter after a flower that only blooms when the moon is full. They say she was once a pirate, but no one ever saw her aboard a ship, only walking the beach at night, holding the child's hand, watching the waves, listening for ghosts. On the island, Anne added one more carving. This one she buried, not in sand, but in soil, a piece of her story, planted deep so that when they left, something of her would remain, a marker, a memory, a whisper. Still flying, they left the island at dawn. No farewell, no rituals, just movement. Quiet, steady, determined. The boat rocked beneath them as they pushed off from the beach, the sky painted with the pale blue of early light and the soft bruising of clouds that promised no storm, just wait. Anne sat in the middle of the small craft, Rosa tucked against her, wrapped in layers of cloth and warmth. Lorna took the stern, her hands firm on the oar, guiding them through the shallows, over the reef, and into open sea. Behind them the island grew smaller, its palms shrank, its hills folded into the horizon. Anne did not look back, not because she was ungrateful, but because she had learned that sometimes memory is clearer when the eyes are closed. They followed the stars. Lorna navigated using the moon, the wind, and an old instinct that seemed stitched into her bones. The boat moved north and west, past silent keys and jagged rocks, past birds that screeched overhead and fish that shimmered below. For 2 days they saw no one. On the third they saw smoke, a single column rising slow and steady from an inlet carved into a low island shaped like a hook. Lorna slowed the oars. Anne held Rosa closer. The baby stirred, her dark eyes opening, blinking at the light. Smoke means people, Anne said quietly, or danger, or both. They turned toward it. The village was small, thatched roofs, narrow paths, women in loose linen dresses and wide-brimmed hats, men with salt-slick hair and skin darkened by years of sun. There were no walls, no soldiers, just nets drying on poles, fish smoking in pits, and the sound of children's laughter blending with the rustle of palm leaves. They were met at the shore by an old man with a scar across his throat and a walking stick carved from driftwood. He didn't ask questions, just pointed toward a shaded lean-to near the market and said, in a hoarse voice, "You can rest there. Pay when you can. Leave when you must." Anne thanked him with a nod. Lorna nodded too, though she kept a hand on the knife at her belt. That night, Anne slept on a cot for the first time in months. Rosa curled beside her, fists balled beneath her chin, breath slow and even. Anne stared at the ceiling, woven reeds patched with cloth, the occasional flutter of lizards moving across them. The village was alive, but not loud. It pulsed with the rhythm of people who had nothing to prove. No coins changed hands that night, only bread, dried fruit. A handful of rainwater poured into a clay basin. Anne lay still for a long time, not from fear, from unfamiliar comfort. In a coastal town near Veracruz, long before Anne's time, there had been a woman named Soledad. She had once served on a Spanish merchant vessel disguised as a boy. When the ship was taken by pirates, she did not plead or panic. She simply changed her name and asked to join. She spent 20 years at sea. No flag, no allegiance, only wind and wood and tide. When she retired, no one knew. She simply vanished. But in the quiet town where she eventually settled, locals spoke of a healer with strange tattoos who could set a broken bone with a single touch and who refused to be paid in anything but stories. She lived in a house built from shipwrecked timber, and when she died, no one claimed her body, only the sea. It came up the shore that night, farther than usual, washed away her footprints, and left behind a single coin balanced perfectly on her doorstep. Anne walked the village each morning with Rosa in a sling, Lorna beside her, silent and alert. They bought rice, fish, a tin cup, They listened more than they spoke. No one asked their names. No one needed to. In places like this, you didn't need a history, only the will to stay and the wisdom to know when to leave. Rosa took her first steps in the sand behind the marketplace, stumbling, laughing, falling. She stood again. Anne watched her, knees pulled to her chest, chin on her hands, heart full and aching. "She's already further than I ever imagined," she whispered. Lorna stood beside her, arms crossed. "She'll go even further." Anne smiled. "And we'll make sure she can." They stayed 12 days. On the 13th, a ship docked at the far end of the beach. Not a warship, not a merchant, just a weather-beaten schooner with patched sails and a name scorched into its side. Solace. Anne watched it from a distance, then turned to Lorna. "Let's ask if they need a cook." Lorna raised an eyebrow. "Or a navigator?" Anne smirked. "Or two women who don't care where it's going." The captain was a woman with white in her hair and rings on every finger. She listened to Anne's quiet pitch, glanced once at Rosa, then said, "I don't ask questions if you don't bring trouble." Anne replied, "We only bring the wind." And so they boarded. No fare paid, no names given, just three figures stepping from land to sea as if they'd always belonged there. At the stern that night, Anne stood with Rosa in her arms, watching the shore shrink to a thin line behind them. Lorna joined her, face half in shadow. "You think we'll find somewhere to stop?" Anne asked. Lorna looked forward to the horizon. "Maybe, but that's not the point." Anne nodded. The stars blinked into view one by one. The sails filled. The ship groaned, then surged forward. And Anne Bonny, pirate, prisoner, mother myth, smiled into the wind. The Solace was no ship of grandeur, no floating fortress bristling with cannons or gleaming with polished brass. She was a vessel of scars. Her timbers sun-bleached, her sails mended with patches of all colors, her ropes stiff from years of salt and sun. But she held herself well in the water, smooth, balanced, sure of her path. Anne felt it in her feet the first morning aboard, the old rhythm, the sway beneath her toes, the sound of water slapping the hull, the creak of wood that spoke like an old friend welcoming her back. She carried Rosa in a sling tied across her front as she helped swab the deck, not with the urgency of a pressed hand or the brashness of a new crew member, but with the quiet steadiness of someone who had done this before, who knew the rhythm, who remembered what it meant to live where the horizon was always moving. Lorna kept to herself. She spent her time helping the ship's bosun mend torn sails and checking knots with practiced fingers. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, and never without purpose. The crew learned quickly not to question either of them. The captain, a woman who called herself Maeve, watched from the helm. She was older than Anne by 2 decades at least, her eyes the pale gray of storm-silver clouds. She wore no uniform, only a linen shirt, a red scarf, and a necklace made of carved bone. She spoke little, but what she said always mattered. On the third night, as the ship sailed west, cutting across quiet waters beneath a waning moon, Maeve approached Anne where she sat near the galley hatch, rocking Rosa softly in her arms. "You've been on a ship before," Maeve said. Anne didn't look up. "A long time ago." Maeve crouched, one hand on the rail. "You keep your feet better than half my crew, and you don't flinch when the boom swings." Anne smiled faintly. "I was someone else then." Maeve studied her. "You still are someone." Anne didn't reply, but Rosa stirred as if to remind them both. Maeve stood. "This ship's not forever, but it goes where you ask it to. When you've had enough sea, say the word. I'll set you down somewhere quiet." Anne nodded once. That was all. Far south, in a bay shaped like a sleeping bird, there once lived a woman named Karina. She had been a pirate once, captained her own vessel, the Asterion, through storms and blood and betrayal. She was known not for how many ships she took, but for how many she let go. She had a rule. If a captain surrendered without loss of life, she returned their ship, after taking only the smallest prize, a ring, a hat, a story. She collected them like charms. When Karina vanished, no one believed she had died. Sailors claimed to have seen her in distant ports, cloaked in shadow, watching ships from the dock like someone remembering a past life. And in one village by the sea, there is a shrine built into a cliff, with a stone carving of a woman cradling a star. They say Karina came ashore with a baby in her arms and never left. They say sometimes when the wind is right, you can hear her laugh echoing through the gulls. Anne found herself laughing more often now. Not loudly, not recklessly, but with surprise, with softness. Rosa began babbling as they sailed. Not full words, just sounds. M sounds. Ah sounds. Gurgles that echoed with curiosity. One day as the sun dipped low, painting the sea in orange and rose, Rosa reached out and touched the compass hanging from Anne's belt. Anne looked down. Rosa pressed her fingers to the center, then looked up and said, with perfect clarity, Ma. Anne's heart stopped, and then it started again, faster, warmer, fuller. She pulled Rosa close, buried her face in the soft curve of her daughter's neck, and laughed into her skin. Lorna, watching from a few paces away, smiled too, just barely. I told you she was going far, she said. Anne wiped her eyes. She already has. They sailed for weeks, past islands draped in green, past shores dotted with fires that flickered and vanished by morning. They stopped rarely, only when the crew needed fresh water or fish ran low. Anne began carving again, small pieces of driftwood, bone, shell. One she shaped into a dolphin, sleek and smooth. Another, a hand cradling a flame. But her favorite was the one she made of Rosa's feet, 2 tiny imprints side by side, like steps taken on a path not yet traveled. She kept that one tucked beneath her pillow every night. One evening, Maeve called Anne to the helm. We're nearing the fort, she said, pointing toward the edge of the map spread across a barrel. One path heads toward the Bahama chain, other toward Port Sorrow. Anne raised an eyebrow. That a real name? Not the one it was given, but the one it earned. Anne looked out over the waves. What's there? Peace, if you can stomach it. A cove, a market, a chapel no one uses anymore. Some say it was a haven for washed-up sailors. Others say it was cursed by a woman who died waiting for a lover who never came. Anne traced the edge of the map. What do you say? Maeve shrugged. I say it's where people go when they're done running, or at least tired of it. Anne was quiet. Then she said, take us there. Maeve nodded. We'll reach it in 2 days. Anne returned to her bunk. Rosa slept soundly. Lorna sat polishing her blade. We're stopping again, Anne said. Lorna nodded. You think we'll stay? I think, Anne began, then paused. I think I want to see what it feels like to stop choosing between escape and survival. Lorna looked at her long and steady, and then said, then maybe we'll learn what it means to simply live. Anne smiled, not because she believed it fully, but because she wanted to, and that was enough, for now. The ship sailed on, the stars held their breath, and Port Sorrow waited. The sky was bruised with dusk when the Solace reached the edge of Port Sorrow. From a distance, the cove looked like a forgotten corner of the sea, a crooked mouth carved into the coastline, guarded by jagged rocks and flanked by mangroves that clawed their way into the water like roots reaching for something lost. The harbor itself was shallow, calm, and tinted green with years of undisturbed growth. No warships docked here, no flags flew. The place had the quiet weight of history, the kind buried deep beneath silence. As the ship glided inward, sails low and creaking, Anne stood at the rail, Rosa pressed to her shoulder. The child was quiet, eyes wide, watching the new place unfold like a story. Lorna stood beside her, arms crossed, gaze sharp. Looks half dead, she said. Anne nodded. Then maybe it won't mind 2 ghosts more. Port Sorrow had once been a port of passage. That much was clear from its bones. There were stone foundations overtaken by vines, stairwells leading nowhere, docks worn down to splinters, and the remains of a market square where salt still clung to the corners like memory. A few people still lived there. Not many, not loudly, just enough to remind you that the world didn't end, it just faded into new shapes. An old woman ran a bakery from what used to be a chapel. The windows were gone, but the scent of bread rose warm and soft in the mornings. A quiet man with one arm kept bees and sold honey in wax-wrapped jars. 2 brothers tended the overgrown gardens and watched the sea with eyes that did not miss much, but judged even less. When Anne stepped off the Solace, barefoot and holding Rosa tight, no one asked who she was. No one asked what she had done. They only offered her a place to sit, a bowl of warm stew, and a nod. It was enough. They found shelter in an abandoned watchman's hut at the edge of the bluff. It leaned slightly eastward, as if listening to the waves. The roof was intact, the floor dry. Windows looked out over the cove, and at night you could hear the tide moving in and out like a slow, patient breath. Lorna repaired the door with wood salvaged from a collapsed jetty. Anne cleaned the hearth and laid Rosa's bedding by the wall where the sun would reach in the mornings. They didn't speak of staying, but each day more things were unpacked, hung, settled. The days passed in simple rhythms. Anne rose early, fed Rosa, walked to the market for water and bread. Lorna fished off the rocks or helped mend nets in exchange for salt and oil. The villagers accepted them without questions. They had all been new once. One night, Anne sat outside the hut, carving a small piece of driftwood into the shape of a crescent moon. Rosa played beside her, crawling in slow, deliberate movements, picking up pebbles and leaves, cooing to herself. Lorna approached with a small bundle of fish. Her boots were wet. Her hands smelled of brine and wind. They said there's a woman here who used to be a surgeon, Lorna said. Anne looked up. Retired? Lorna shrugged. Abandoned, maybe. She grows herbs now, helps women birth their children. Anne tilted her head. Why tell me? She offered to teach you. Anne blinked. I didn't ask her to, Lorna added. She saw you with Rosa, said you had calm hands. Anne looked down at her own fingers. Scars, burns, lines from rope and blade. Maybe, she said softly. Maybe I do. In the hills beyond Port Sorrow, there was once a cabin where a woman lived alone for 23 years. Her name had been Magdalena, though she went by many others. She had once been a pirate, then a prisoner, then a ghost. When she came ashore, she brought only a small chest, a black dog, and a book filled with the names of people she had saved, or failed to. She built her life from stone and smoke. She tended bees, boiled tinctures, and buried every bird she found with broken wings. She was not feared, nor beloved, only known. When she died, her cabin remained untouched. Inside, on the wall above her bed, was scratched a single line. I kept going. That is all. Anne began to learn the names of plants, the healing ones, the dangerous ones, the ones that did both, depending on how much you asked of them. She sat with the herb woman, Calla, and listened as she explained which roots cooled fevers, which leaves soothed hunger, which flowers spoke to the wind. Rosa played in the dirt nearby, hands always busy, voice a gentle babble. Anne began to carry a pouch of herbs when she walked. And when a child in the village scraped her knee, it was Anne who knelt and cleaned the wound, who wrapped the cloth, who whispered a quiet song until the girl stopped crying. No one thanked her. Not because they were unkind, but because it was understood. This now was what Anne Bonny did. One afternoon, as the sun slanted low and the sky wore the color of old parchment, Maeve returned to Port Sorrow. The Solace docked for only a night. Anne met her on the pier. You found something here, Maeve said. Anne nodded. Not something I knew I needed. Maeve looked at Rosa, now walking with a slow, determined wobble beside Lorna. You're not running anymore. I'm not hiding, either. Maeve reached into her coat and handed Anne a small package. Inside, a compass. Worn, cracked. Anne looked at her. It always pointed toward freedom, Maeve said. Now maybe it points toward peace. Anne didn't reply. She didn't need to. They stood there in silence, the sea whispering between them. And when the Solace sailed away at dawn, Anne didn't board. She stood on the shore, Rosa in her arms, Lorna beside her, and she waved, just once. Not goodbye, but thank you. Port Sorrow held its name, but not its sorrow. Not anymore. Not for her. The days in Port Sorrow began to lose their edges. They no longer arrived with urgency, nor departed with haste. They blended, one into another, soft as mist, shaped by the tide and the hush of wind through worn trees. There was no calendar here, only rhythm. The rise of the sun, the shift of shadows, the smell of baking bread from the chapel-turned bakery, and the slow blooming of salt lilies along the shore. Anne had begun to forget the exact number of weeks they'd been there. And for once, that forgetting felt like healing, not danger. Rosa was walking now, not just a few tottering steps, but full, confident strides. Her small feet found their way through the sand, over the grass near the bluff, into puddles, and out again. Her voice was full of sounds, curious, insistent, sometimes full of joy, sometimes wild with protest. Anne watched her like someone watching the tide, awed, cautious, grateful. Lorna had started building a table outside the hut, nothing grand. Just driftwood, rope, and nails pulled from abandoned crates. She didn't say what it was for, but Anne saw her measuring it against the morning light, as if she planned to sit there each day at dawn and do nothing at all. It was becoming a home, not a hiding place, a home. One evening, just after the sun fell into the sea, The villagers gathered at the edge of the cove. A woman named Maris was to be buried. She had died quietly, in sleep at the age of 93. She had once been a sailor, then a tavern keeper, then a quiet presence who knew when to speak and when to listen. She had no children of her own, but every child in the village had called her Maman Maris. Her body was wrapped in linen, her face washed, her hands folded with a sprig of mint between them. No sermons were given, only stories. People stepped forward one by one and offered memories. Anne stood back, Rosa on her hip, listening to voices weave together a life. And when no more stories came, the villagers laid Maris to rest in the earth above the tide line. Someone sang a low, wordless melody. Lorna stood beside Anne, her arms crossed, her eyes dark. "I've seen too many burials," she murmured. Anne nodded. "Me too, but never one like this." No, there was silence between them. Then Anne added, "When I die, I don't want a grave." Lorna glanced over. "Why not?" "Because I've had enough of being tied to one place." Lorna smirked. "So you want to become driftwood?" Anne smiled. "Or wind?" That night Anne dreamed. She was on a ship, not the Solus, not any ship she had ever known, but something older, made of memory and starlight. Rosa stood at the helm, not as a child, but as a woman, tall, fierce, eyes like dusk. Mary Reed was beside her, grinning, one boot propped on the rail. Jack Rackham sat on the mast, whistling a song with no tune. And Anne was not herself. She was something larger, a shadow in the sails, a whisper in the waves, a name remembered when no one else was watching. She woke with tears on her cheeks and the smell of the sea in her mouth. Outside, Rosa was already up, crouched near the herbs, plucking leaves with the curiosity of a healer in training. Anne watched her and whispered, "She's already more than I ever was." Lorna stirred behind her. That's the point. Weeks passed. Anne began helping at the bakery. She kneaded dough with firm hands, the same ones that had once tied knots and held pistols. The old woman who ran the place, known only as Jory, taught her how to read the fire by scent, how to fold the edges of crust to hold warmth, how to trade 3 loaves for a day's worth of stories. Anne was a fast learner, and people began to smile when she approached. Not with wariness, but welcome. One afternoon, a merchant ship docked, small, worn, flying no flag but faded canvas. Its crew were quiet, tired, polite. Anne sold them 2 jars of callous tincture and a bundle of sweetbread wrapped in cloth. One of the sailors, an old man with storm-colored eyes, looked at her for a long moment. "You're her," he said, not quite a question. Anne tilted her head. "I'm me." He hesitated, then nodded. "It's good what you're doing." Then he left. She never asked how he knew. She didn't need to. That night, Anne took her carvings down from the wall, not because she was leaving, but because she was ready to start new ones. She set aside the crescent moon, the bird with folded wings, the woman holding flame, and she picked up a fresh piece of wood. She carved slowly, a child walking into the sea. Behind her, 2 shadows, watching, waiting, smiling. In Port Sorrow, they say the tide changed the day Anne arrived, not in its pull, but in its purpose. It no longer carried the past in, it began to carry the future out. The rain came that night, not a storm, not a deluge, but a soft, steady fall that soaked the earth without flooding it, as if the sky itself were weeping gently with relief. It tapped against the roof of the hut, rolled down the leaves, and pooled in the dips of the stone path outside. Anne stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the water bead on the tips of the banana trees. The scent of damp earth and salt filled the air. Behind her, Rosa slept deeply, her small body curled like a seashell beneath a woven blanket. Lorna was sharpening a blade, as she often did when the sky turned gray. "Never liked the rain," Lorna said quietly. Anne turned her head. "I never trusted clear skies. They always promised something they couldn't keep." Lorna smirked. "We're a good pair then." They said no more after that. The rain did the talking. In the days that followed, the village slowed with the weather. The fishers stayed ashore, tending to nets and hulls. Children gathered under eaves, chasing rivulets with twigs and shells. Bread was baked early, eaten slowly, savored. The usual trades at the dock dwindled to a murmur. Anne found herself moving through the quiet like she belonged to it. Her steps matched the hush of rain, her thoughts braided with the rhythm of falling water. She spent more time in the old chapel-turned-bakery. Jory, her mentor in yeast and fire, had begun to teach her the finer secrets, when dough could be felt instead of measured, how salt should taste against heat, the silent language of steam escaping crust. "You've got stillness in your hands now," Jory said one morning. Anne blinked. "I used to have fire." Jory wiped flour from her knuckles. "Same thing if you know what you're doing." One afternoon, a boy from the village came running up the hill to the hut, soaked to the skin, eyes wide. "There's a ship," he panted, "at the edge of the cove. Doesn't look friendly." Anne was already on her feet before he finished. Lorna stood, blade in hand. "Did they dock?" Anne asked. "No, just drifting." Anne lifted Rosa, tying her securely against her back. The child murmured, sleepy but calm. Anne packed a pouch with dried bread, herbs, the small carved totem she couldn't bear to leave. They didn't panic, they prepared, just as they always had. At the edge of the bluff, the ship sat in the rain like a wolf too proud to hide. Black hull, no flag, still, watching. Anne crouched in the underbrush, breath slow, heart even. Lorna beside her, eyes narrowed. "They haven't moved," Lorna said, "yet." Anne studied the deck. No visible crew, no rowboats lowered. "They're waiting," she said. "For what?" Anne didn't answer at first. "Then for someone who doesn't live here anymore." Lorna looked at her and nodded. They returned to the village, silent and swift. They told no one to flee, only advised quiet, watchfulness. The people of Port Sorrow were no strangers to visitors who brought smoke. But the rain never stopped. The ship didn't move. And by the second dawn, it was gone. Vanished without word, without anchor lifted, without sail hoisted. Anne stood on the beach that morning. Rosa clutched close, waves tugging at her boots. Lorna stood beside her, hair slick with mist. "Do you think they knew it was you?" she asked. Anne stared at the horizon. "I think they came looking for something," she said, "and found the sea instead." Years before, in a town swallowed by jungle, there had lived a woman who had once been feared across 3 empires. Her name had been Celine. She commanded a fleet of gunships. She traded powder for silence and blood for maps. Her wrath was whispered through ports like a warning bell. Then, one day, she vanished. She was found decades later, tending a garden of fire-petaled flowers that only bloomed once a year. Her hands had long lost their calluses. Her eyes had grown quiet. When asked why she left the sea, she said only, "I had nothing left to take, so I learned how to give." She never told them who she had been. But every spring, the flowers she planted still bloomed, and no map records the name of the town, only the color of its blossoms. That night, Anne burned her old boots, the ones she had escaped in, the ones she had walked in for years through forests, sand, salt, and sorrow. She placed them on a flat stone, poured oil, and lit them with a single match. Lorna watched from the doorway. "You sure?" she asked. Anne nodded. "I don't need them anymore." The fire burned low and blue. Rosa watched from her mother's lap, blinking at the flames as they crackled and died. Anne kissed the child's brow and whispered, "That part of the journey is over." In Port Sorrow, the rain finally ceased on the 7th day. The sky cracked open in the early hours, and light poured through like a blessing. The village emerged slowly, like a breath held too long. Children laughed louder. Waves sparkled. Anne hung herbs out to dry, her hands working with ease. Lorna took down the blade from over the door and hung a wind chime in its place, shell and bone and brass. And Rosa, now walking with certainty, stepped out into the sun and laughed for the first time in weeks. A sound like bells, like new sails catching wind, like a story being born, not told. Born. The sun, when it returned, arrived like a memory rediscovered, golden, gentle, and a little unsure of itself. It stretched across the village in long, forgiving beams, catching the dew on the leaves and making the rain-slicked cobbles of Port Sorrow shine like new coin. It warmed the skin, dried the bones, and lifted a silence that had become too heavy to name. Anne stood outside the hut that morning, a shallow basin of water at her feet. Rosa splashed in it, laughing as her small hands slapped at the ripples. Her hair was growing longer, darker, her legs stronger, more certain. Her laughter rang off the stones like a hymn. Lorna sat on the bluff, mending the sailcloth she used as a canopy. For once, her blade lay beside her, not in hand, not honed, just resting. Calla passed by with a basket of oranges and left 3 on the edge of their windowsill without a word. Anne smiled, raised a hand in thanks. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Something had changed since the ship came and went. The village had seen it. So had the sea. And Anne, most of all, felt it. Not as fear, not even as finality, but as permission. Later that day, Anne walked with Rosa on her hip down the winding trail to the cove. The tide was low and the wet sand was dotted with tiny shells and broken coral. Crabs scurried, birds picked through the shallows. The world was busy with quiet work. Anne let Rosa walk for a while, like her bare feet sinking into the cool shore. The child wobbled, steadied, and pointed excitedly at a silver fish darting in the surf. "You've never been afraid of the sea," Anne murmured. Rosa babbled in response, a string of nonsense and song. Anne looked out over the water, the sunlight glinting off its surface. She remembered being 17, standing on a pier in Nassau, her fists clenched and her jaw tight, watching the sails of her first stolen ship fill with wind. Back then, she had wanted only freedom, not safety, not peace, just the power to choose her own damnation. She smiled, faint and far away. Now her hands were full with something else entirely, and it was heavier, more precious, more dangerous than any cutlass or pistol, a future. That evening, the village gathered for a meal beneath the banyan tree near the old bakery. Jory had roasted fish wrapped in banana leaves. There was rice with herbs, a stew of lentils and coconut, and sweet bread rolled in cinnamon bark. Everyone brought something. Laughter passed from hand to hand like wine. Old songs were sung, the kind with no known author, only memory. Even Lorna tapped her fingers along the table to the beat. Rosa sat in Anne's lap, wide-eyed and sticky-fingered, grinning with a mouth full of yam. Someone asked Anne to tell a story. She hesitated, then leaned forward. "I once sailed with a woman who cut down 5 men in a bar fight," she said, "because one of them said her laugh sounded like a crow." There were chuckles. She said to me afterward, "If you're going to be mistaken for a bird, it may as well be one that flies alone." A pause. She was the loneliest person I ever knew. More silence this time, not heavy, just listening. She died in a prison cell, but her laugh stayed with me. I hear it when the wind gets high. She looked down at Rosa, whose eyes were already fluttering towards sleep. "I think she would have liked this place." Jory raised her cup. "Then she's welcome here." They all drank to that. That night, Anne sat outside the hut while Rosa slept. The moon was high, the wind soft. The chime Lorna had hung above the door tinkled gently. Anne picked up her carving knife again. The newest piece of wood was smoother than the others, paler. It reminded her of bone, but warmer. She carved slowly, not a ship, not a bird, but a flame. Cradled in 2 hands, when she finished, she turned it over in her palm and set it beside the others. Lorna came to sit beside her. "Calla says there's a woman in the southern islands," Lorna said, "who's collecting stories from women like us." "Like us? Ones who didn't stay buried." Anne nodded. "And what does she want them for?" "A book, a song, a warning." Anne leaned back, eyes on the stars. "Maybe I'll send her something." "She'd take it," Lorna said, "even if it was just your name." Anne was quiet a moment. "Then I don't think I'm finished yet." Lorna smiled. "That's not what I meant." Anne chuckled. "No, I suppose it's not." In the archives of forgotten ports, there are stories of women who vanished before they were erased. Not saints, not martyrs, not monsters, just women who chose their own endings, or refused to end at all. One such tale speaks of a pirate named Anne Bonny, but it never ends the same way twice. Sometimes she sails off into the horizon. Sometimes she plants a tree and never leaves. Sometimes she becomes the storm, sometimes the calm after it. But always, always, she is still out there, somewhere, waiting for the wind. The wind came from the east that morning, soft at first, brushing the tops of the palms, stirring the chimes above the hut door. It slipped through the village like a whispered story, catching in laundry lines and moving through the narrow paths with a quiet insistence. It smelled of open water and old salt, of rain that hadn't yet fallen, and sails that might rise again. Anne noticed it the moment she stepped outside. She stood on the edge of the bluff, Rosa on her hip, watching the sea glisten with morning light. The tide was coming in slowly, with long, shallow breaths. It brought with it fragments of shell, bits of driftwood, and the hushed sense of something approaching. Lorna joined her a few minutes later, tying her hair back against the breeze. "It's shifting," she said and nodded. "I feel it too." "Not danger, just change." Anne adjusted Rosa's sling. The child was heavier now. Not a baby, not quite a girl. She leaned her head against Anne's shoulder, quiet, observing. "I've been wondering," Anne said, If maybe the sea's not finished with me. Lorna didn't answer right away. Then she said, or maybe it's offering you something different this time. Anne glanced over. A second beginning? Lorna's eyes narrowed slightly. Not every tide returns what it takes, but sometimes it offers something else in exchange. Later that day, they found a bottle on the shore. It was wedged between two rocks, half buried in seaweed. Lorna spotted it first and plucked it out with a careful hand. The glass was thick, greenish, old. The cork sealed tight. Inside, a piece of paper, carefully folded. Anne opened it slowly, hands steady, heart uncertain. The note was written in ink, faded to brown, the letters looping and elegant. To the woman who once commanded storms, if you're reading this, it means your name has not been lost. There are others. We are listening. We remember. When the time comes, come find us. You will know the wind. No name, no signature, just the shape of a crescent moon at the bottom. Anne traced it with her finger, then smiled. In the weeks that followed, she kept the message in a tin box beneath her bed, beside Rosa's first carved toy and a small piece of sailcloth from the Solace. She didn't tell anyone else in the village about it. Only Lorna. They sat beneath the banyan tree that evening, just sharing bread in silence. She's not just yours anymore, Lorna said quietly, watching Rosa chase a crab down the path. I know. She'll need more than peace. Anne nodded. She'll need a story. One night, Anne took Rosa down to the cove and pointed at the stars. There, she said, is the dog star. It watches the tides. There's the belt. Those 3 stars, that's where the moon keeps her compass. And that one, she whispered, her voice dropping to a hush, that one is mine. No name, no claim, just a place I look when I need to remember who I was. Rosa reached up, pointing at the dark. Bird, she said. Anne laughed softly. Close enough. One morning, a boat arrived from the south, not large, just a trading skiff. The woman aboard was old, wrapped in layers of red and blue cloth, her arms inked with spirals and symbols Anne didn't recognize. She brought fruit, salt, and something else. Stories. She spoke in riddles and song, but one thing she said stuck. There is a meeting coming. Not war, not peace. Just voices that have waited too long to speak. Women who remember. Ships that do not forget. The sea is calling them back. She looked at Anne. Some names rise, yours is among them. Anne said nothing, but her hands trembled, just a little. That night, Lorna found her outside, staring at the sky again. You thinking of leaving? Lorna asked. No, Anne said. I'm thinking of returning. To what? To a version of myself that never got to finish her sentence. Lorna sat beside her. And Rosa? She'll come too. She'll know where she came from. And me? Anne looked over, smile flickering. You were always coming with me. Lorna let out a slow breath. Then we'll need a ship. Anne nodded. We will. In the far corners of the sea where maps fade and the compass spins, sailors tell of a vessel that sails under no flag. A ship crewed by women who do not ask for mercy and offer none. A ship that doesn't raid, doesn't conquer, just appears when it's needed. They say the captain has fire-red hair, a scar near her throat, and eyes that remember every storm. They say she sails not for revenge, nor gold, nor pride, but because there are stories that must be told and winds that must be answered. They say her name is Anne, but no one dares call her by it. They just say, she's back, and the sea listens. The ship came 3 weeks later. No one in Port Sorrow saw it arrive. There was no horn, no cry from the docks, no thunder of oars. It simply appeared on the morning tide, anchored just beyond the cove, sails furled, hull dark as volcanic stone, trim lined with pale, bone-white paint that shimmered in the rising sun. Anne was feeding Rosa when she noticed it through the window. The spoon paused halfway to the child's lips. Lorna, standing by the door, followed her gaze. The ship sat silent, waiting. Rosa, sensing the shift in the air, turned her head and looked too. Her small voice broke the silence. Boat! Anne smiled. Yes, love, a very old one. By midday, the village knew. But no one approached. No one asked questions. They only watched quietly from behind baskets of bread and lengths of drying net. Some nodded, others offered small blessings under their breath. Anne walked to the bluff that evening, Rosa on her hip, Lorna beside her. From there, the ship looked like something carved from a dream or a memory. The flag it flew bore no colors, only a symbol. A single flame cradled between 2 open palms. Anne inhaled slowly, then exhaled. She's real, she said. Lorna nodded. She's yours. No, Anne said. She's ours. They stood in silence for a long time, then turned back toward the village. There was work to do. That night Anne packed simply: a satchel of herbs, the wooden totems, a loaf of bread wrapped in linen, a small compass, old, cracked, still true. She wrapped Rosa in a shawl dyed the color of tide pools and tucked her gently into the sling across her back. Outside, Lorna waited with a bundle of tools strapped to her shoulder and a rope belt slung with 2 knives. Her eyes were sharp, but her stance was calm. They walked through Port Sorrow under starlight. No one stopped them, but many watched. Calla stood at the edge of her garden and handed Anne a tiny pouch of dried lavender. "For the baby," she said. Anne pressed it to her heart. The old beekeeper saluted them with a crooked smile. Jory passed them a warm hand roll without speaking. They said no goodbyes. "Only see you again," in the way that kind people always do. At the shore, a small boat waited, sent from the larger ship, crewed by 2 women with weathered hands and bright eyes. One had silver rings in her ears, the other tattoos of wings on her neck. They nodded once as Anne stepped aboard. "Captain," one said. Anne shook her head. "Just Anne." The boat pushed off. The oars slipped into the sea without sound. Behind them, the village lights shimmered, soft and golden. Ahead, the ship rose larger with every stroke. The climb up the side was easier than Anne remembered. Her muscles still remembered what it meant to board something that floated and breathed. Lorna hoisted herself up without help. Anne handed Rosa into the waiting arms of the tattooed sailor, who cradled the child like a story passed down through generations. When Anne stepped onto the deck, a silence fell. The crew stood ready, not stiff, not formal, just present. They watched her, not as strangers watch a ghost, but as kin greet someone returning from far inland. A tall woman stepped forward. Dark skin, white hair, long coat that fluttered like sails. Her boots were worn, her presence steady as gravity. "You made it," she said. Anne looked at her. "Was I expected?" The woman smiled. "Only by every wind that remembers your name." Anne looked around at the ship, at the faces, at the ocean. Rosa reached for her hand. Anne took it. "Then let's sail." The ship turned on the tide. Sails lifted. Ropes hummed. The figurehead, carved into the shape of a bird mid-flight, creaked with life as the hull split the water. Port Sorrow faded behind them, but not as something lost, as something complete. They sailed for days, then weeks. They did not raid. They did not flee. They arrived where they were needed, one island at a time, one shore after another. Anne taught Rosa the names of clouds. Lorna taught her how to tie knots. The crew called her Little Flame. She answered to all of them, and laughed like someone who knew the sea would never take her mother again. In the waters where maps go blank, where stories end or begin depending on who's telling them, sailors speak of a ship with no home port, a crew with no fear, a child raised by the tides, and a captain with eyes like firelight, steady, warm, and never forgotten. They say she does not fly a flag. She does not give warnings. She sails when she wishes. And when she comes ashore, something always changes. A village is saved. A secret is uncovered. A ghost is remembered. A woman is freed. They say her name is Anne Bonny, but most don't dare speak it aloud. They just whisper she chose her own ending, and she never stopped writing it.